There is a story that began long before the tournaments, the transformations the galaxies held in trembling hands. It began with a small boy living alone in the mountains, with a four-star ball he carried everywhere, as though it were the most sacred thing in the world, because to him it was. This is that story, the quiet, unhurried, original lore of Dragon Ball, the foundation beneath everything you love about this universe. So let yourself settle in, let your shoulders drop. And if this helps you rest tonight, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. There is something deeply particular about the way Dragon Ball began. Not the way it would come to be remembered, not the screaming skies and golden hair and battles that shook moons from their orbits, but the way it actually started, quietly, in a forest, with a boy who had never seen another human being. Akira Toriyama introduced Goku to the world in the autumn of 1984, when the first chapter of the Dragon Ball manga appeared in Weekly Shonen Jump in Japan. The date was November 3rd of that year, and the chapter was called Bulma and Son Goku. That title itself says a great deal. Not Son Goku alone, not Bulma alone. Two characters, side by side from the very first moment, their story already intertwined before a single word had been read. Toriyama had already made a name for himself by then. His previous series, Dr. Slump, had been a massive success, running from 1980 to 1984, and the character of Ariel, that cheerful, oblivious android girl, had become a beloved figure in Japanese pop culture. But when Dr. Slump concluded, Toriyama was given the opportunity to begin something new, and what he chose to create was entirely different in spirit. Though it carried many of the same qualities that had made his earlier work so beloved, warmth, humor, a deep affection for its characters, and the visual language that communicated entire inner worlds through the placement of a single panel, before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The original inspiration for Dragon Ball came from a classical Chinese novel called Journey to the West. This was not a secret Toriyama kept. He acknowledged it openly, and the influence was visible in ways both broad and specific. The novel, written in the 16th century by Wu Cheng'an, follows a Buddhist monk named Tang Sanzang as he travels from China to India to retrieve sacred scriptures, accompanied by a group of unusual companions. The most famous of these companions was Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, a figure of extraordinary power, mischief, and eventual redemption. Toriyama took this figure and transformed him gently and affectionately into a small boy with a tail, living alone in the mountains, carrying a mysterious orange sphere that had once belonged to his grandfather. The name Son Goku is the Japanese reading of Sun Wukong. That lineage is there in every panel. The Dragon Balls themselves, those 7 orange spheres with their increasing number of stars, were Toriyama's own invention, a device for setting the story in motion without locking it into a single location. The premise was elegant in its simplicity. 7 magical orbs scattered across the world. Gather all 7 and a dragon appears. The dragon grants 1 wish. Then the balls scatter again, turning to stone for 1 year, and the world returns to waiting. This was the engine of the story. But engines alone do not make stories worth telling. What Toriyama understood and demonstrated from the very first chapter was that the Dragon Balls were never really the point. The point was who found them, and what it cost them, and what they learned along the way. Bulma Brief was 12 years old when the story began. She was the daughter of a brilliant scientist, a girl who had inherited her father's intellect and her own restless ambition, and she had spent 2 weeks tracking 1 Dragon Ball to a remote and nearly unreachable stretch of wilderness. The Dragon Ball she was following, the 2-star ball, had led her by her own invention to the mountains where Goku lived. It is worth pausing here to consider what that invention was. Bulma had built by herself a device she called the Dragon Radar, a small, handheld instrument capable of detecting the faint energy signature emitted by each Dragon Ball. She was 12 years old. This detail tends to pass without comment in most discussions of early Dragon Ball, but it should not. Bulma's intellect was not ornamental. It was structural. Without her radar, the story literally could not have happened. The Dragon radar would go on to be one of the most quietly significant pieces of technology in the entire series. It was rebuilt, repaired, copied, and modified across hundreds of chapters and episodes. It was destroyed and recreated. It traveled to Namek. It sat in the pocket of characters who took it entirely for granted. But it was Balma who made it, in her bedroom at age 12, because she wanted something and she figured out how to reach it. The first meeting between Goku and Bulma has been analyzed many times, and it deserves every moment of that attention. Goku, who had never seen a girl before, immediately thought she was some kind of monster. He picked up her car, the capsule car she had been riding in, as though it were a toy. He held it over his head and waited for it to do something threatening. Bulma, for her part, shot him with a gun. Twice. This is on its surface a comedic scene, and it is. But it is also, if you look at it carefully, a complete introduction to both characters in the span of a few panels. Goku was not frightened. He was curious. He had been hit by the car and he was annoyed, but his response was to investigate rather than flee. When the bullet struck him, he checked himself for injury, found none, and moved on. He was not performing bravery. He simply had no framework for understanding that he should have been afraid. His entire life had been the mountains, the animals, and his grandfather's stories. He had never encountered anything that could genuinely hurt him. He did not know that was unusual. Bulma, meanwhile, was already calculating. The gun had not worked. Her first plan had failed. She looked at this strange boy, this small, apparently invulnerable boy with a monkey tail, and she shifted immediately to her second approach. She noticed he was holding a Dragon Ball. She offered him something in return for his cooperation. She adapted. These two approaches, Goku's curious, fearless engagement with the world and Bulma's sharp, adaptive intelligence, would define their dynamic for the entirety of the original series, and in many ways beyond it. The first saga of Dragon Ball is commonly called the Pilaf Saga, and it runs for 23 chapters in the manga. Its primary mission, in terms of pure plot, is to gather all 7 Dragon Balls. But the gathering is incidental to what the saga is actually doing, which is introducing the world. Over those 23 chapters, Goku and Bulma travel through landscapes that feel both fantastical and grounded, stumbling into towns and deserts and fortresses and forests that all seem to follow their own internal logic. The world Toriyama built in these early chapters was not a grand cosmic stage. It was small, human-scaled, full of odd little corners and strange local customs, and people who were doing their best in circumstances they only partially understood. Oolong arrived early in this journey, and he is worth dwelling on for a moment. He was presented as a fearsome monster who had been terrorizing a small village, kidnapping young girls and holding the community in a state of fear. This was the setup, the punchline, and it is a punchline, delivered with Toriyama's characteristic timing, was that Oolong was a small pink pig who had the ability to transform into other shapes, but who could only hold any given form for approximately 5 minutes before reverting. His reign of terror had been built entirely on panic and the power of rumor. In person, confronted and unmasked, he was simply a coward with a useful ability and a very inflated sense of his own menace. Toriyama immediately pressed Oolong into service as a companion, and the decision to keep him in the story was shrewd. Oolong functioned as a grounding agent. Where Goku was fearless and Bulma was confident, Oolong was perpetually terrified of everything, perpetually focused on the most immediate and selfish possible interpretation of every situation, and perpetually being dragged along into danger he wanted no part of. His cowardice was not played for contempt, it was played for recognition. Oolong was, in many ways, the most human character in the early story, the one most likely to look at a dangerous situation and say out loud what many readers were already thinking. Yamcha came shortly after, and his introduction followed a similar structural pattern. an apparent antagonist revealed to be something more complicated. He and his companion Puar ambushed the group in the desert, intending to rob them. Yamcha was presented as confident, capable, and genuinely skilled in combat. His technique, the Wolf Fang Fist, was powerful enough to put Goku on the back foot, which in these early chapters was not a small thing. But Yamcha had a problem. He was terrified of girls. Pathologically, absurdly, completely terrified, unable to speak or function in the presence of any female. This meant that every time he came close to achieving his goal, Bulma's presence destroyed his composure entirely. He would freeze, stammer, and flee. His ambitions outran his ability to execute them, and for the most specific and embarrassing reason possible. This, again, is comedy, but it is also characterization. Yamcha's fear of girls was not just a running joke. It was a vulnerability in someone who otherwise presented as tough and capable. And Toriyama would use that tension carefully over the course of the saga, allowing Yamcha to eventually overcome it. Partially, gradually, in the way real people overcome real fears, and in doing so grow into an ally rather than an obstacle. The Dragon Balls in this first saga were discovered in locations that ranged from the mundane to the genuinely strange. One was being used as a good luck charm by an old woman in a small town. Another was in the possession of a turtle whom the group helped reach the ocean, a kindness that would eventually have enormous consequences, though no one could have known it at the time. The turtle was an old friend of Master Roshi, and Roshi, in gratitude for the turtle's safe return, gave Goku a cloud. Not just any cloud, a cloud called the Flying Nimbus, Kintoan in the original Japanese, a small, golden, impossibly fast vehicle that would carry only those with a pure heart. Goku could ride it immediately, without effort, without training, without any kind of qualification process, beyond simply being who he was. This was, in its quiet way, one of the most significant reveals of the early story. The cloud did not ask for strength. It did not ask for intelligence or ambition or any of the qualities the other characters possessed. It asked only for purity, and Goku had that in such abundance that he barely even understood it as a quality. It was simply how he was. Roshi himself was introduced in this scene, and his introduction was carefully calibrated to be funny before it was meaningful. He lived alone on a small island with his turtle, and he was an old man with a thick white beard and a shell on his back and an unapologetic enthusiasm for young women that would become one of the most persistent running gags of the series. He was, on the surface, ridiculous, deliberately, affectionately ridiculous. But Toriyama never let the ridiculousness entirely obscure what was underneath it. An old man of immense skill and depth, who had trained for decades and had seen things that few living beings could claim to have witnessed. Roshi also gave Goku something else in this early meeting. He gave him the turtle school uniform, the orange and blue gi with the kanji on the chest and back, the uniform that would become, in time, one of the most recognizable pieces of clothing in the history of animation. The uniform was not elaborate. It was not designed to impress. It was a training outfit, practical and simple, but it was his, and he wore it, and it fit him in ways that went beyond the physical. The orange of it caught the light. The number of panels in which that orange appears, moving through the world, becoming more and more familiar until it is simply inseparable from the character. That accumulation is one of Toriyama's quietest achievements. Emperor Pilaf, for all his theatrical villainy, was not a particularly threatening antagonist. And that was entirely the point. He was small and blue, and he lived in a large, underpopulated castle, and he had two subordinates, Shu, a dog man with a perpetually nervous demeanor, and Mai, a capable and quietly competent woman who spent most of her time managing the consequences of Pilaf's terrible decisions. Pilaf wanted to rule the world. He had wanted this for a very long time. He had assembled his team and built his fortress and developed his plans and waited for the moment when the Dragon Balls would fall into his hands. The moment came. He got his wish. He held all 7 Dragon Balls, summoned Shenron, the great dragon who answered every call with the patience of something very old and very used to dealing with people who wanted things, and prepared to make the wish that would give him dominion over the world. And then Oolong interrupted him. At the exact moment when Pilaf opened his mouth to speak his wish, Oolong shouted his own wish first, the most ridiculous, most Oolong-appropriate wish imaginable, born entirely of a combination of cowardice and desperation, and the particular way that Oolong's mind worked under pressure. The world was saved not by strength or strategy or any kind of heroic sacrifice, but by a pig blurting out the wrong thing at exactly the right time. This is what the Pilaf saga was. It was funny. It was small. It was full of characters making imperfect decisions for entirely comprehensible reasons. And it ended with Goku and Bulma going their separate ways, briefly, and Goku continuing into a world that was wider and stranger and more full of possibility than even these 23 chapters had suggested. The tournament saga arrived next, and it shifted the story's register in ways that would prove foundational. Goku, following Roshi's advice, sought out training. He did not seek it because he was afraid of being weak. He sought it because someone had told him that if he trained with Roshi, he would become stronger. And Goku understood strength not as a prize to be won, but as a process to be engaged with. The distinction matters. For Goku, training was not preparation for something else. Training was itself the thing, the effort, the pushing, the finding of new limits and then moving beyond them. This was, in the most literal sense, what Goku was for. Roshi agreed to train him, but added a complication. Another student would join. Krillin arrived at Kama House with a stack of magazines and a request that Roshi sign them all, and the dynamic between him and Goku was established immediately and permanently. Krillin was clever, adaptable, and deeply motivated. He was also, compared to Goku, quite ordinary, not in the sense of being unremarkable, but in the sense of being comprehensibly human in his drives and his fears and his ambitions. He wanted to impress girls. He wanted to be the best at something. He wanted to matter. What followed was one of the most beloved training sequences in the series. Roshi's methods were unusual, to put it gently. He had his students milk a cow, which required chasing the cow. He had them deliver milk, which required running up mountains and through forests with heavy loads before dawn. He had them till fields by hand. He had them swim through shark-infested water. He had them dodge bees. He had them study. And he had them do all of this while wearing heavy shells on their backs. It was, by any conventional measure, absurd. But it worked. And Toriyama showed it working not through a training montage, but through the slow accumulation of small improvements. The way Goku stopped needing to catch his breath after the morning run, the way Krillin's form on the field began to look less desperate and more controlled, the way both boys began to move through the world with a slightly different quality of attention. The training was doing something, not just physically. It was teaching them to work. It was teaching them to continue. The 21st World Martial Arts Tournament, the Tenkaichi Budokai, was Dragon Ball's first great stage, and it remains one of the most carefully constructed competitive settings in the series. Toriyama understood that tournaments work for a specific reason, and that reason is not the fighting. The reason is the information a fight delivers. A match between two skilled opponents tells you who both of them are in ways that extended backstory cannot replicate. You learn who a character is by watching what they do when they are losing. You learn what they value by watching what they protect. You learn their limits by watching them hit those limits, and then watching what happens next. The tournament had a preliminary round, which eliminated most of the entrants, and allowed the story to establish who the actual contenders were. Among them, besides Goku and Krillin, were Yamcha, making his return, and a mysterious fighter known only as Jackie Chun, an old man with a familiar-looking beard and a familiar-looking bald head who insisted loudly that he was absolutely not Master Roshi in a wig. He was, of course, Master Roshi in a wig. But the story played this with remarkable sincerity, allowing the characters to remain genuinely uncertain while allowing the audience to be in on the secret. And the effect was a particular kind of comedy that Toriyama returned to repeatedly, the comedy of information asymmetry, where the gap between what the characters know and what the reader knows becomes its own source of gentle humor. Jackie-chan Roshi was there because he did not want his students to win. Not yet. He had watched them improve over the months of training, and he had recognized something that they themselves had not yet fully understood. That winning too soon would ruin them. That a champion who had not yet had to truly struggle would mistake their current ceiling for their actual limit. He was there to beat them, for their own sake, and to show them that there was still an enormous distance between where they were and where they could eventually go. This is not a complicated philosophy, but it is a true one, and the tournament gave Toriyama the space to enact it in full. Goku's match against Jackie Chun in the finals is worth particular attention. It was, by the standards of anything that would come later, a modest fight. Two people in a ring, no energy blasts of continental scale, no transformations, no dramatic revelations of hidden power. But it was a fight between someone who had been training for decades and someone who had been training for months, and the gap between them was real. Roshi had to genuinely try. And Goku, despite being a child of 12 who had been practicing martial arts for fewer than 12 months, made Roshi genuinely try. The result was a loss. Goku lost the tournament on a technicality involving the moon and a transformation that Toriyama had planted carefully in the story's background. But the loss was not a defeat in any meaningful sense. It was a measurement. Goku had gone into that ring not knowing how far he had come, and he left knowing there was still much further to go, and that knowledge was worth more to him than the trophy would have been. He ate dinner that night and went to sleep, and the next morning began moving toward whatever was next. What was next was the Red Ribbon Army. The Red Ribbon Army saga is, in terms of sheer narrative ambition, the most sprawling and inventive portion of the original Dragon Ball story. It runs across a substantial portion of the manga, from approximately chapter 54 to chapter 26, and it carries Goku through an extraordinary range of environments and encounters that collectively build a picture of a world far larger and more complex than the Pilaf saga had suggested. The Red Ribbon Army was, in essence, a private military organization with global reach, sophisticated technology, and a single obsessive goal: the Dragon Balls. Commander Red, the head of the organization, wanted the balls for reasons that would eventually be revealed as the saga's central bittersweet irony. He had spent extraordinary resources, employed hundreds of soldiers, deployed advanced weaponry, and built an empire of fear and obedience, all in service of a wish that revealed in its smallness everything about who he was. But the saga did not reveal that immediately. It built toward it slowly, through a series of encounters that each had their own internal logic and their own particular emotional texture. Goku encountered the Red Ribbon Army almost by accident. He was searching for the 4-star Dragon Ball, his grandfather's ball, the one most precious to him, and that search brought him into conflict with the army's forces. He defeated them not because he was trying to dismantle their organization, but because they were between him and what he was looking for, and he moved through them the way water moves through obstacles. Not with malice, not with strategy, simply with persistence and the particular quality of force that Goku possessed without entirely understanding that he possessed it. The army sent its best agents after him, one by one, and the saga became in part a tour of those agents' abilities. Each of the Red Ribbon generals was a distinct personality with a distinct approach to combat, and Toriyama gave them enough individual texture that their defeats meant something beyond mere obstacle clearing. Colonel Silver was among the first. He was capable and cold, a man who moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to winning, and Goku ended his story quickly and without particular drama. This was intentional. Silver was not the point. He was an introduction, a way of establishing that the Red Ribbon Army, for all its resources and organization, was not prepared for what Goku was. General White came later in Muscle Tower, and his saga within the saga was structured differently. Muscle Tower was a building a tall, foreboding fortress in the far north, and climbing it floor by floor gave Toriyama the opportunity to create a kind of vertical adventure, each level presenting a new challenge with its own rules and its own atmosphere. Among the residents of Muscle Tower was Android 8, called 8 by Goku, and Ater by the villagers he eventually protected. He was a large, gentle, soft-spoken android, built by the army with the express purpose of being a weapon, and he was incapable of fulfilling that purpose because he could not bring himself to hurt anyone. He had been designed for violence, and he was constitutionally irreducibly opposed to it. This was not a malfunction. It was, in the most complete sense, who he was. His friendship with Goku was brief and genuine, and it established something about Goku that would be returned to many times in the series: his openness. Goku did not see an army weapon when he looked at 8. He saw a large person who was scared and kind, and he responded to that reality rather than the one the army had constructed around it. His ability to meet people where they actually were rather than where the world had placed them was not innocence, or rather, it was a particular kind of innocence, not the innocence of ignorance, but the innocence of attention. Sergeant Major Purple, also known as the Ninja Murasaki, was another notable encounter within Muscle Tower, and his confrontation with Goku demonstrated something important about how Toriyama constructed his comedy within the action. Murasaki was introduced as a fearsome, skilled, highly trained ninja, a figure of genuine menace in the world the army had built. He moved quickly and quietly, and he had techniques that no ordinary fighter could counter, and then Goku defeated him in ways that were progressively more humiliating. Not because Goku was trying to humiliate him, but because Goku simply responded to each technique with the most direct and practical solution available, and the most direct and practical solution kept turning out to be something Murasaki had not anticipated because it made no sense in the framework of conventional combat. This is a consistent structural joke in early Dragon Ball, and it never entirely stops being funny because the premise renews itself with each new version. Someone has built an impressive system, and Goku breaks it not by finding the system's flaw, but by failing to recognize that the system exists. He does not understand that he is supposed to be impressed. He does not understand that the technique is meant to be impossible to counter. He simply responds to what is actually in front of him. And what is actually in front of him is usually someone standing in a particular place, and Goku moves around them. The Dragon Ball the army was after in Muscle Tower's region had already been taken by a scientist named Dr. Flap, who lived in the nearby village and who was connected to the army in ways the village did not know. The ball was eventually recovered, and the village was freed from the army's grip, and Goku moved on carrying the 4-star ball a little closer to him. But before he moved on, he received something from the village, a gift, a small robot named Suno. No, a gift assembled by the villagers as thanks. Among those gifts was something that would matter, the knowledge of where the Dragon Balls were and the encouragement of people who had been saved. This was another quiet thing Toriyama was building. Goku was not accumulating power in the way that later Dragon Ball stories would make central. He was accumulating connections. Every place he went, he left people behind him who were better than they had been before he arrived, and who remembered him. The world was not unchanged by his presence. It was marked by it. The desert region held more of the army's forces, and it was here that a different kind of encounter waited. General Blue was, by the standards of the Red Ribbon Army, exceptional. He was powerful, he was precise, and he possessed a psychic ability, a technique that allowed him to paralyze opponents completely with a glance. That should, by any practical measure, have made him unbeatable in a one-on-one fight. He used it with discipline and efficiency, and he used it on Goku, and it worked. Goku was paralyzed completely, and Blue prepared to finish the fight. And then a mouse ran across the floor. General Blue was terrified of mice. Profoundly, completely terrified. So terrified that when the mouse appeared, his concentration shattered entirely. His psychic grip broke, and Goku was free. The defeat that followed was swift and thorough. This is the comedy of Dragon Ball at its most distilled. A powerful, disciplined, aesthetically composed antagonist undone by a small rodent. The joke worked not because it was mean-spirited, there was nothing mocking in Toriyama's presentation of Blue Sphere, but because it was human. Because everyone, regardless of their strength or their skill or the impression they present to the world, has a mouse somewhere, has something small and real that breaks the composure they have worked so hard to construct. The joke was about fear, and the joke was gentle, and it landed. The path to the Red Ribbon Army's headquarters wound through Penguin Village, and this detour deserves particular appreciation because of what it represents structurally. Penguin Village was the setting of Dr. Slump, Toriyama's earlier series. Having Goku arrive there, having these two separate Toriyama worlds briefly share space, was a gift to readers who had followed him from his earlier work, but it was also something more than nostalgia. It demonstrated that Toriyama thought of his creative worlds as inhabiting the same imaginative geography. They were not separate realities, they were adjacent neighborhoods in a larger place. RL and her companions welcomed Goku with the same warmth and chaos they brought to everything, and Goku responded with the same open curiosity he brought to every new environment. The crossover was brief and light and full of the particular energy of Toriyama drawing characters he deeply loved, and then it was over, and Goku continued toward the army's stronghold. The battle at the Red Ribbon Army's headquarters was, in its construction, a statement. Goku arrived alone. He was one boy, approximately 12 years old, against a fortified military compound staffed by hundreds of trained soldiers with advanced weaponry. Every conventional assessment of the situation would have concluded that the boy had no chance. He walked through the front gate. The sequence that followed was not triumphant in a loud way. It was not accompanied by dramatic music or extended displays of power. Goku simply moved through the compound, responding to each threat as it appeared, and the soldiers and the weapons and the vehicles and the fortifications were, one after another, insufficient. He was not angry. He was not particularly determined. He was looking for the Dragon Balls, and the army was in the way, and he removed the obstruction the way he removed every obstruction, with direct, uncomplicated, completely genuine effort applied at the point where it was most needed. Commander Red fell last, and with him fell the revelation that had been waiting at the center of the saga. His wish, the wish for which all of this had been done, for which all of this suffering had been caused, was simply to be taller. He wanted the Dragon Balls to make him taller. He was a small man who wanted more than anything to not be small, and he had built an empire around that wanting. And the empire had been destroyed by a boy who was not yet tall enough to see over the hood of a standard military vehicle? This was Toriyama's sharpest joke, and also his most compassionate one. Red's wish was ridiculous, and it was also understandable, because the desire to change the thing about yourself that the world sees first, the thing you cannot hide and cannot change and that colors every interaction and every relationship, that desire is not ridiculous at all. It is simply human. And the empire he built around it was monstrous and wrong, and it was still, at its root, the expression of something very ordinary and very sad. After the Red Ribbon Army, the story paused in a way that mattered. Goku gathered the remaining Dragon Balls, not all of them, as it turned out, and attempted to make his wish. And here the story introduced Baba, and in doing so, expanded the world in a direction it had not yet gone. Fortune teller Baba was Roshi's older sister, a tiny ancient woman who rode a crystal ball and charged for her services in ways that were creative and occasionally alarming. She could locate anything in the world, and Goku needed her help to find the last Dragon Ball. But her fee was not monetary. She required challengers to defeat 5 of her fighters, and if the challengers succeeded, she would provide her service for free. The 5 fighters were a strange and specific collection: a mummy, a creature called Devilman who possessed a technique called the Devil Might Beam, a technique that amplified the evil in a target's heart to the point of destruction, a spike-headed warrior named Dracula Man who could turn into a bat and had, among his other attributes, the ability to steal objects from opponents, and a final fighter whose identity, when revealed, was one of the most quietly emotional moments in the early story. The final fighter was Grandpa Gohan. He had died. He had been killed accidentally by Goku himself in the form of the great ape during a full moon Goku could not remember, and he had been gone since before the story began. He existed, in the story up to this point, only in Goku's memory, in the four-star ball, in the training, in the way Goku had learned to fight and to care for himself, in the particular quality of tenderness Goku showed toward anyone older and smaller than him, the quality that came from having been raised by someone older and smaller who had shown him only kindness. Baba had the ability to bring the dead back to the living world for one day. And so Gohan stood before his grandson in the ring, wearing a mask that Goku saw through almost immediately, not because Goku was strategic, but because Goku knew the feeling of his grandfather's fighting style, the way most people know a voice or a face. He recognized him in the first exchange of blows. He recognized him in the posture, and the timing, and the particular rhythm of the counters. And he was not frightened by it, and he was not paralyzed by it. He fought, and then he stopped fighting, and then they were together for the afternoon, and then they were not. This is the moment in early Dragon Ball that is most commonly cited by readers who were not expecting to be moved by it. The story had been building comedy and action, and a world of extraordinary invention. And then it did this, quietly, without fanfare, without any music or any narration calling attention to itself, and it was completely real and completely gentle, and it is still, decades later, entirely capable of catching a reader off guard. The tournament saga of the 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai arrived after Goku's journey to Kirin Tower, and by that point the series had begun to change in subtle but significant ways. Kirin Tower was a tall white column reaching impossibly high into the clouds, and at its top lived Kirin, a small white cat of great age and presumably greater wisdom, though his approach to wisdom was to make those who sought it figure out what they were actually asking for. The treasure at the top of Kirin Tower was sacred water, Senzu no Mizu, that was said to grant enormous power to those who drank it. Goku climbed the tower, arrived at the top, and spent 3 days trying to steal the water from Kirin, who held it without apparent effort, and watched Goku try with the patient amusement of someone who had seen this many times before. The water, it eventually turned out, was ordinary water. It had no special properties. The power that climbers gained from visiting the tower came entirely from the effort of trying to take the water, from the focus and awareness and physical development that chasing Kirin for 3 days demanded. Kirin was not guarding a treasure. He was administering a training program. Goku drank the water anyway, mostly out of principle. By the time of the 22nd tournament, Goku was 13. He had grown, not enormously but noticeably, in the way that matters more than height, in the quality of his attention, in the range of his technique, in the depth of his endurance. Krillin had grown similarly, and the tournament field had grown with them, including a new figure who would become one of the defining presences of the original series. Tien Shinhan arrived with Chiaotzu, and his introduction was carefully designed to be unsympathetic. He was cold, precise, and contemptuous, dismissive of the others in ways that were not the dismissal of arrogance, but of genuine trained superiority. He had been raised by a man named Master Shen, the crane hermit who was Roshi's oldest rival, and he had been raised specifically to be a weapon, to win, to dominate, and to show no interest in anything that did not serve those goals. He was, at the start, not a good person. This is worth saying plainly. He was not misunderstood. He was not a good person doing bad things for good reasons. He was a highly skilled fighter who had been trained to care about winning and nothing else, and he had internalized that training completely. What the tournament did, what Goku's presence in the tournament did, was introduce him to someone who did not fight that way and still won. Not always, not easily, but consistently enough and in ways unexpected enough that Tien began to question the framework he had been given. The arc of Tien's character across the 22nd tournament and the events that followed it is one of Toriyama's most quietly accomplished pieces of long-form characterization. A person raised with a specific set of values, confronting evidence that those values are incomplete, and choosing, slowly, imperfectly, not without backsliding, to become something else. Krillin was killed at the end of the 22nd tournament, and this is the moment that Dragon Ball's tone began, slowly, to shift. He was killed by Tambourine, an agent of Piccolo, the Demon King Piccolo, who had just been released from his imprisonment and who was, unlike every antagonist the story had presented before him, genuinely and completely concerned with destruction, not dominion, not wishes, not personal transformation of any kind, destruction. He wanted to eliminate all martial artists, and then he wanted to take the Dragon Balls, and then he wanted to wish for his youth back, and then he wanted to rule a world emptied of the people who might oppose him. Piccolo Daimao, to give him his full title, was Dragon Ball's first villain who did not have something small and understandable at his center. Commander Red had his wish for height. Pilaf had his wish for power, which was at least a comprehensible ambition. But Piccolo wanted something that had no ordinary human shape. He wanted the world to be worse. He wanted to be the reason it was worse. Krillin's death was the story's first death of a central character, and Toriyama did not soften it. Krillin was not given a long goodbye. He was alive and then he was not, and the fact of it was clean and terrible, and Goku felt it in the way that people who love without reservation and without defense feel losses. Completely, immediately, with nothing to absorb the impact. What happened next was something the story had been building toward without announcing it. Goku's grief turned to anger, and his anger turned to something the series would not yet name or explain, a surge of power that was qualitatively different from anything he had demonstrated before. He pursued Tambourine and he defeated him with a completeness that left no room for ambiguity. It was not the most powerful moment in Dragon Ball's history, or even in the original series, but it was the first time Goku's capacity felt genuinely unlimited. The first time the story implied that what Goku could do when pushed past a certain point was not simply stronger than what he normally did, but different in kind. That implication would carry forward for decades. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Piccolo Daimao's saga continued with the recovery of the Dragon Balls and the wish for youth and a confrontation with Goku that was, by the standards of everything that had preceded it, enormous in its stakes and its emotional register. Goku was defeated. He was defeated badly. He was broken in ways, bones shattered, unable to move, unable to fight, that the series had not previously allowed him to experience. The story sat with that defeat, let it be complete, and then asked what Goku would do with it. He drank a Sanzu bean, recovered, and climbed Korin Tower again. And this time, Korin told him there was nothing more he could offer. The water was gone, the training was done, and whatever Goku needed next was above the tower, not within it. Above the tower was the lookout, a great floating platform at the edge of the upper atmosphere. And there lived Kami, who was, as the story revealed with characteristic calm, the very source of the Dragon Balls themselves. Kami was the guardian of the earth, an ancient being of extraordinary power who had split himself long ago into good and evil, the good remaining as Kami, the evil manifesting as Piccolo Daimao. They were, in the most literal sense, one being divided, which meant that killing Piccolo would kill Kami, which meant that the Dragon Balls would cease to exist, which meant that Krillin could not be brought back. This was the bind at the heart of the King Piccolo saga's resolution, and it was not a bind that Toriyama resolved with cleverness or with a loophole. It was resolved with a choice. Goku chose to fight Piccolo, not to kill him, understanding what killing him would mean, but to defeat him, to protect the world from what Piccolo would do to it, and to leave the question of what came after to whatever came after. Piccolo was defeated. He survived, narrowly, and with a final act that planted a seed the story would return to, and the Dragon Balls were preserved, and Krillin was brought back, and the world continued. What Piccolo's survival planted was this. Before losing consciousness, he expelled from his body one final egg, which he sent away with the instruction that it would grow and avenge him and defeat Goku. That egg would hatch into the Piccolo who became, across the next and final arc of the original series, one of the most complex characters Toriyama created. The Piccolo Jr. saga occupies the last portion of the original Dragon Ball story, and it runs across the 23rd World Martial Arts Tournament. 3 years pass between the end of the King Piccolo saga and the beginning of this one, a time skip that Toriyama used deliberately, allowing both Goku and the world around him to change in ways that the immediate continuation of the story could not have achieved. Goku arrived at the tournament as a young man of approximately 15 or 16, depending on the accounting, and the other characters did not recognize him at first. He had grown. He was taller, not dramatically, but enough to read differently on the page. His face had settled into something with more gravity in it. The boyishness was still there, but it was resting atop a foundation of something more substantial, and the story communicated this not through any statement, but through the way Goku moved through the preliminary rounds, still direct, still unhurried, but with a quality of inevitability that had not been present before. Chi-Chi was also at the tournament. She had been introduced much earlier in the story, a young girl, the daughter of the Ox King, who had encountered Goku during the Red Ribbon Army saga and who had, with the directness of someone who knew her own mind, asked him to marry her. Goku had agreed without fully understanding what agreeing meant, because Goku at that age did not know what marriage meant. When he saw her again at the 23rd tournament, she reminded him of this agreement. He honored it, not because he was obligated, but because the agreement had been made, and Goku did not unmake things. Their relationship was, even in its origin, something that the story treated with respect and with humor in roughly equal measure. Chi-Chi was strong-willed, and she knew what she wanted, and she was not particularly interested in having those things negotiated away from her. Goku was not particularly interested in resisting. The dynamic this created would become one of the most enduring in the series, not without friction, not without misunderstanding, but fundamentally rooted in genuine affection, expressed in ways that neither of them fully articulated, but that the story consistently demonstrated. Piccolo, the new Piccolo hatched from the egg, was everything his progenitor had promised. He was cold, powerful, and entirely committed to the task he had been born to complete. He was also, beneath those qualities, something the story did not rush to reveal, a person in the most fundamental sense, capable of change, capable of preference, capable of the particular kind of growth that comes from sustained contact with someone who will not accept the version of you that you have decided to present to the world. That someone, of course, was Goku. Their match in the finals of the 23rd tournament was the culmination of the original Dragon Ball story in the most complete sense. It contained, within its structure, echoes of every fight that had come before it. The beam struggle, the moment when two powerful techniques meet and neither gives way immediately, and both fighters push against each other across the air between them, appeared here in what may have been its original form. The visual that would be repeated and expanded and made into one of Dragon Ball Z's most iconic motifs. The giant form battle appeared here too, with Piccolo briefly expanding to a size that dwarfed the arena and everything around it. And through all of it, Goku refused to kill. He had the opportunity. Several times he had the opportunity, and he did not take it. Not because he was incapable, but because he did not want to. He wanted to win the tournament. He wanted to protect the people around the ring. He wanted to demonstrate that Piccolo could be defeated without being destroyed, and in demonstrating it, he wanted to show Piccolo something about what was possible. This is the thesis of early Dragon Ball, stated finally and completely in the last fight of the original story. That strength is not the end of something, but the beginning. That winning is not the point. That what you do with the people you defeat matters as much as the defeating itself. Goku won the fight, and then he gave Piccolo a Senzu bean and let him go, and the story ended, and the world was already different for what had happened. The Dragon Balls themselves, the objects at the center of all of this, The objects for which everything had moved and everything had been risked have their own history that runs through the original lore, like a thread that only becomes fully visible when you step back far enough to see the whole pattern. They were created by Kami. This is the central fact, and it was revealed quietly, almost in passing, during Goku's visit to the lookout. Kami had made them thousands of years before the story began, and their power was tied to his life. If he died, they turned to stone. If they were used, all 7 turned to stone and scattered, and 1 year had to pass before they would work again. They could grant any wish within the Creator's power. They could not wish the same person back to life more than once. They could not grant a wish that exceeded the power of the one who made them. These limitations were not arbitrary. They were the shape of what the Dragon Balls were. They were powerful in specific ways and bounded in specific ways, and the boundedness was what made them meaningful. A device with no limitations is not a device. It is a solution, and solutions are the end of stories. The Dragon Balls were never solutions. They were catalysts. They started things and they complicated things and they forced characters into motion, and when the motion was done and the wish had been made, they scattered again and waited for someone else to have something worth asking for. Over the course of the original Dragon Ball, 4 wishes were made with the Dragon Balls. The first, Oolong's improvised intervention during the Pilaf saga, was barely a wish at all. The second, made by Piccolo Daimao, was for his youth restored. The third brought back the victims of Piccolo's servants. The fourth brought back Goku. Each wish was an event in itself, a moment that the story surrounded with specific weight and specific consequence. Shenron appeared, and the sky darkened, and the balls floated, and the dragon's voice was like the turning of something enormous. He granted what was asked, and then he was gone, and the balls were stone, and the year began again. The image of Shenron, that great dark dragon, sinuous and ancient, summoned by the accumulation of what the world's most earnest seekers could find, is one of Dragon Ball's most durable visual inventions. He was not frightening exactly, but he was immense, and his imminence was a quality that the original series maintained by not overusing him. He appeared at the moments when the story required the full weight of what the Dragon Balls promised, and then he retreated, and the world remembered that it could not depend on dragons to solve its problems. The supporting characters of the original Dragon Ball are worth spending time with, because the care with which they were constructed is not always fully appreciated. Yamcha's journey across the original series is a story of incremental revision. He began as an antagonist, an obstacle in the desert, a capable fighter with a debilitating social phobia. Over the course of the story, he moved toward the group, slowly through demonstrated commitment and through the specific kind of trust that forms between people who have been in danger together, until he was, by the time of the tournament sagas, fully one of them. His arc is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There is no single moment of transformation. There is simply the accumulation of choices over time, moving in a consistent direction. Krillin, from his first appearance to his death and resurrection, was Dragon Ball's most fully realized human character. He was skilled and he was limited, and he trained anyway, because what the limitation meant was that he had to be smarter and more adaptable than the people who were simply stronger than him. His relationship with Goku was the best friendship in the original story, built on mutual respect and competitive affection, and the particular warmth that develops between people who have trained together, who know exactly what the other person can do and how hard they work to be able to do it. Tien's transformation from cold instrument of victory to something more conflicted and more human took the entire length of the original series to complete, and it was not finished when the series ended. He remained complicated. He remained someone working against tendencies that had been installed in him by years of specific training in a specific direction. But he was working against them, and that intention was visible, and it mattered. Even Chiaotzu, small, pale, quiet Chiaotzu, who did not often speak and was most frequently present as a companion to Tien, had moments of genuine significance, most notably in his willingness to die rather than let the people he cared about be harmed. His sacrifice was like most things in the original series, low-key in its presentation and enormous in its weight. The world that housed all of these characters was as carefully drawn as the characters themselves. Toriyama was, before he was a storyteller, an artist, and the original Dragon Ball manga contains visual ideas that are as distinctive and considered as anything in its narrative. His layouts moved between the intimate and the expansive with fluency. A page could contain a tender small panel of a character at rest and a full-width image of the landscape they were moving through, and the transition between these registers felt natural rather than jarring, because Toriyama understood how both contributed to the same atmosphere. The world was colorful in the sense of being full of different kinds of place. There were deserts and forests and ocean islands and mountain ranges and cities that felt like they had been there for centuries, and cities that felt like they had been built last week. The technology was inconsistent in ways that were charming rather than confusing. Capsule technology coexisted with horse-drawn carts, advanced military vehicles flew over dirt roads, a turtle could ask for directions and be understood. The world was not consistent in the way of a carefully plotted fantasy universe. It was consistent in the way of a dream, coherent in its emotional logic even when its practical logic was doing something imaginative. The inhabitants of this world were drawn with the same care. Toriyama's background characters, the people in crowds, the shopkeepers, the soldiers and villagers and bystanders, were individuated in ways that most manga did not bother with. They had faces, they had expressions, they had the quality of people who had been there before the story arrived and would be there after it left. This gave the world a sense of genuine population, of being inhabited rather than merely depicted. Akira Toriyama's development as an artist and storyteller across the original Dragon Ball run is something that can be traced directly in the pages themselves. The early chapters were already accomplished. Toriyama had years of professional experience behind him, and his work on Dr. Slump had given him a fluency with comedy and character that most artists take much longer to develop. But the original Dragon Ball demanded something different from him, and the series shows him finding it. The tournament arcs are where the fight choreography began to come into its own. Early fights in the series were energetic but relatively simple. By the time of the 21st tournament, Toriyama had developed a vocabulary of panels and angles and the use of negative space to convey speed and impact that would define the visual language of Dragon Ball for the entirety of its run. He found ways to make still images feel like motion, to communicate the weight of a blow through the arrangement of debris and dust, and the posture of figures on the page. This development was not abstract. It had a direct effect on the emotional experience of reading the fights, because the better the choreography communicated, the more genuinely the reader felt what was at stake. A fight that reads as a series of impacts is different from a fight that reads as a conversation carried out with full bodies, where each move is a response to the previous one and the whole sequence builds towards something. Toriyama got better at the second kind as the series progressed, and by the King Piccolo and Piccolo Jr. sagas, his fight sequences had a sophistication that was still casual and clean, but was no longer simple. The philosophy at the center of Dragon Ball's original story is one that does not announce itself, but that is present in almost every chapter. Master Roshi expressed it most directly in the context of the 21st tournament, when he explained why he had entered in disguise to defeat his own students. The goal of training, he said, was not to become a champion. The goal was to become better than you were. A champion who stopped growing was already declining. A student who lost and learned was already on their way to something greater than the trophy they had just surrendered. This philosophy was embodied by Goku in a way that went beyond mere endorsement of Roshi's lesson. It was simply who Goku was. He was not interested in being the strongest for the sake of being the strongest. He was interested in the fight, in the experience of meeting another skilled person in the space of a contest, and finding out what was possible, finding the edges of what he could do, and then moving past them. Winning was a measure. It was not the point. The point was whatever the fighting revealed. This orientation toward growth over achievement is not common in battle manga, where the accumulation of power and the defeat of increasingly powerful enemies is the primary structural engine. Dragon Ball would eventually lean into that structure more heavily than its original story suggested, but in the original, the structure was different, and the difference was meaningful. The story was about a boy who loved to fight, because fighting was the best way he knew to meet the world honestly, and everything else, the Dragon Balls, the army, the tournaments, the villains, the transformations, was in service of that encounter. The ending of the original Dragon Ball is not an ending in the conventional sense. It does not close things off. It opens them. Goku and Chi-Chi were married. The tournament had been won, and Piccolo had been released into the world as a changed thing. Not reformed exactly, not yet, but altered by the encounter with Goku in ways that would take years to fully manifest. Kami was alive, the Dragon Balls were intact and scattered. Krillin was alive, the world was, in the particular way that Dragon Ball worlds recover from near disasters, intact and recognizable. And Goku was riding his cloud, somewhere above all of it, heading somewhere with Chi-Chi beside him, toward whatever the future was going to be. The story had not concluded so much as paused, taken a breath, acknowledged everything it had done, and then turned to look at what was coming next with the same open, unhurried attention that had characterized its protagonist from the very first chapter. This is, in retrospect, entirely appropriate. Dragon Ball was never a story with an ending in the conventional sense, because its central character was someone for whom endings were never entirely real. There was always another fight. There was always someone stronger somewhere, and that someone would eventually be found, and the finding would be everything. The original story knew this about itself, and it ended the way things that know themselves end. Honestly, without false closure, with the door left open. There are details in the original Dragon Ball lore that even longtime fans of the series do not always carry with them, details that illuminate the larger story when placed carefully alongside it. The 4-star Dragon Ball, for instance, Goku's grandfather's ball, the one he carried from the very beginning, was not simply a keepsake. It was the ball associated with Grandpa Gohan, yes, but it was also the ball that Goku wore as a hat in his infancy, before Gohan found him. It had been with him from the beginning of his life, before he had any memory of it. The fact that it was the most precious object in the world to him was not incidental. It was a piece of his history he could hold. The flying Nimbus was passed down through training lineage. Only students of the Turtle School, or those of a pure enough heart, could ride it. When Goku eventually had children, those children could ride it too. The cloud was not a gift, it was a test that could be administered by possession, and the people who passed it formed over time a kind of family that was not built on blood, but on the particular quality of heart the cloud required. Puar, Yamcha's companion, was a shape-shifting cat who had studied at the same shape-shifting school as Oolong. They were, in fact, classmates who had competed for the same prize, the most difficult transformation. And Puar had succeeded where Oolong had failed. This detail was delivered as a punchline, but it contained a small, quiet truth. Oolong and Puar were mirror images of each other. Two shapeshifters who had gone in opposite directions from the same starting point, one toward selfishness and one toward loyalty. The Dragon Balls had a 1-year dormancy period, which meant that the world between wishes lived with the knowledge that the balls were there but unusable, that the thing which could change everything was present and inaccessible. Stones sitting on the ocean floor or in distant mountains, neither helpful nor threatening, simply waiting. This had a specific effect on the story's sense of time and consequence. Decisions made in the space of an active search for the balls had to be lived with for at least a year before the balls could address their outcomes. The world did not have a reset button. It had, at best, a reset option that required 1 year of patience and the effort of gathering all 7 balls again. The Ox King, Chi-Chi's father, was one of the original Dragon Ball's more interesting peripheral figures. He had been a student of Master Roshi in his youth, one of the earlier generation of students, before Goku and Krillin, before the story began. He had trained at the same place with the same teacher and had become powerful by those standards. But the years had taken his mountain, Fire Mountain, and turned it into a place of perpetual flame. And the Ox King had become a figure of local legend, a large, loud man in a castle of fire, described by those who had heard of him as a monster. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been cut off from help for a long time and had adapted imperfectly to the isolation. His daughter, Chi, fearless and direct, riding into the world with a blade mounted on her helmet, was a portrait of what the Ox King might have been if he had had somewhere to go. Their reunion with Goku, during the initial search for the Dragon Balls, was brief and its implications were not immediately apparent. But that brief encounter was the seed of everything that came after. The marriage, the family, the way the story of a boy who had grown up entirely alone ended with him becoming the center of a network of relationships he had built, one honest encounter at a time. Korin remained at the top of his tower for the entirety of the original series, and the nature of what he actually was, what kind of being, from where, with what history, was never fully explained. He was simply there. He had always been there. He would presumably always be there. He watched the people who climbed to reach him with the patient attention of something that had seen many generations of climbers, and he gave each of them exactly what they needed, which was almost never what they thought they were asking for. His relationship with Roshi was the relationship of two old things that had been in the world long enough to find each other mildly irritating in ways that were essentially expressions of affection. Their arguments were the arguments of people who had agreed on almost everything important for a very long time, and were now focused on the minor points of disagreement, because those were the only ones left. Above Korin, the lookout floated in silence. Kami sat there, watching the world, maintaining the Dragon Balls by maintaining himself. Below the lookout, Mr. Popo tended the grounds and the rooms and moved through his duties with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for longer than most of the story's characters had been alive. These were the keepers of the world's most important secret, that the balls came from a person, that they were contingent, that everything they could provide depended on the continued existence of a small, ancient, gentle being sitting on a platform in the sky, and they kept it quietly, which is exactly how the most important secrets should be kept. The relationship between Dragon Ball and its audience in Japan during its original run was, by any measure, extraordinary. Weekly Shonen Jump circulation during Dragon Ball's most popular period was in the tens of millions, a number that strains comprehension when converted into actual human beings, all of them opening the same magazine on the same day to find out what happened next. Toriyama received feedback from readers through the Jump editorial process, and his responsiveness to that feedback shaped the story in ways that are now part of the series' mythology. Characters who were intended as temporary became permanent because readers loved them. Plot directions were adjusted. The tournament format, which had been so successful in the original run, was returned to because the audience's response to it had been unmistakable. This dynamic between creator and audience is part of what made the original Dragon Ball the particular thing it was. It was not constructed in isolation and revealed as a finished object. It was made in public, week by week, in front of an audience that was present and vocal, and the story has the quality of something that knew it was being watched and found that knowledge energizing rather than constraining. The anime adaptation, which began in 1986, added another dimension to this relationship. The series was produced by Toei Animation and directed by Daisuke Nishio, and it translated Toriyama's manga into sound and color and motion. The voice cast assembled for the series became as iconic, in Japan as the characters themselves, Masako Nozawa as Goku, capturing that peculiar combination of cheerful warmth and absolute fearlessness that was the character's defining quality, Hiromi Tsuru as Bulma, sharp and expressive and entirely capable of making the space she occupied her own, and a cast of supporting voices that built a sonic world around the visual one Toriyama had created and made it something that could be returned to not just in reading, but in listening. The music of the original Dragon Ball anime was composed by Shunsuke Kikuchi, and it has a character entirely its own, light, adventurous, built on themes that carried specific emotional associations across hundreds of episodes, and that settled into the memories of everyone who heard them at a young enough age that the music and the feeling became the same thing. Kikuchi worked with a relatively small instrumental palette for much of the original series, and the economy of his compositions gave them a particular directness. They did not build slowly toward emotional revelation, they arrived at it quickly and then stayed there, repeating themes with small variations in the way that the most honest music often works. Not hiding what it is, not building toward a climax that the rest of the piece has been avoiding, but sitting with the emotional content and letting it be heard. The opening theme of the original Dragon Ball anime, Makafushigi Adventure, was written by Yuriko Mori and became, in Japan, one of the most immediately recognizable pieces of music associated with any animated series. Its energy was different from the action-oriented themes that would define Dragon Ball Z's later identity. It was lighter, more playful, with the quality of movement that suited a story about a boy traveling through a world that was endlessly interesting to him. The legacy of the original Dragon Ball lore in the larger Dragon Ball universe is both immense and, at times, quietly underappreciated. The characters who began in the original story, Krillin, Yamcha, Tien, Chiaotzu, Bulma, the Ox King, Master Roshi, carried their original series characterization forward into Dragon Ball Z and beyond, and the ways in which those characters had been established in the original series shaped everything that happened to them subsequently. Bulma's intelligence, which had been central in the original, remained central throughout her appearances in every subsequent series. Krillin's relationship with Goku, the specific warmth of it, the competition within the affection, remained the same relationship it had been when both of them were children carrying heavy shells on their backs at dawn. The Dragon Balls themselves remained the same mechanism, same rules, same limitations, same Shenron, while the stakes around them escalated. The 1-year rule, the same person restriction, the connection to their creator. All of these constraints persisted because they had been thoughtfully constructed from the beginning, as things that would generate story rather than resolve it. The tournament format never left the series. The Tenkaichi Budokai was returned to repeatedly in Dragon Ball Z, and the Tournament of Power in Dragon Ball Super was, in its deep structure, a direct descendant of the small ring in the mountains, where a boy in an orange gi first proved that he was something the world had not seen before, and Piccolo, the Piccolo Jr., who had been born for revenge and who had fought Goku in the finals of the 23rd tournament, became, over the course of Dragon Ball Z, one of the series' most beloved figures. His transformation from antagonist to ally to something like surrogate father was one of the most complete character arcs in the entire franchise, but it was only possible because of what had been established in the original series, because Goku had refused to kill him, because the defeat had been humane, because the story had insisted from the beginning that the way you treat the people you defeat is as important as the defeating. There is a particular quality to the original Dragon Ball that is difficult to name but immediately recognizable to anyone who has spent time with it. It is the quality of a story that trusts you to find the characters interesting without being told they are interesting, trusts you to understand the emotional weight of a scene without the weight being announced, trusts you to stay with the story across chapters that are sometimes about very small things, a joke about a shape-shifting pig, a cat who won't give up a jar of water, an old man in a wig, and to understand that those small things are in service of something larger, and that the something larger is not going to be unveiled all at once. Toriyama built his story the way you build a friendship, by showing up consistently, by being honest, by allowing the relationship to develop at its own pace, rather than forcing it toward revelations it wasn't ready for yet. The story knew what it was from very early on. It was the story of a boy who was extraordinary and who did not know he was extraordinary. And it was the story of what that quality looked like moving through a world that was also, underneath its fantastical surface, ordinary in the ways that matter. The people in the original Dragon Ball wanted things. They wanted friends, and they wanted to be strong, and they wanted to protect the people they loved, and occasionally they wanted to wish for a perfect boyfriend or to be taller. They were not grand, they were not cosmically significant. They were doing their best in circumstances that were sometimes absurd and sometimes genuinely dangerous. And the story watched them do it with the affectionate attention of someone who found ordinary people genuinely interesting. This is rarer than it sounds. Most stories that achieve the scale Dragon Ball eventually achieved do so by escalating away from the ordinary, by making the characters and their stakes so enormous that the original human-scale concerns become inaccessible. Dragon Ball did escalate enormously, but the escalation was always accompanied by the original characters, who carried their original qualities with them, and who ensured that even in the most enormous moments, there was still something recognizably human at the center. Grandpa Gohan raised a Saiyan child and taught him to be kind, and the kindness was real and it lasted. Bulma built a radar in her bedroom because she wanted something and she figured out how to reach it. And the radar worked, and the story that followed was the story of everything the radar found. Oolong shouted the wrong thing at exactly the right moment, and the world was saved. And then everyone had dinner. Krillin trained until he could not move and then trained the next day, and his friendship with Goku was the best thing in both their lives. Roshi wore a wig and lost on purpose because he understood that losing is sometimes the most important gift a teacher can give. Yamcha walked out of the desert with his fear still intact and began slowly to be something more than the fear. Tien chose, at some cost, to become someone different from the one he had been trained to be. Piccolo survived because Goku decided that how you treat the people you defeat is as important as the defeating, and that decision changed the entire shape of what followed. And Goku rode his cloud through skies that were always the same sky over the mountains where he had grown up alone, the same sky over the tournaments and the deserts and the army's fortress, the same sky over the lookout and the tower and the places where the Dragon Balls were scattered and waiting, and he moved through it with the open, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere particular to be and everywhere in the world to go. There are moments in the original story that deserve to be held in stillness for a while. Moments that do not announce themselves as important, but that accumulate over many readings into something you carry with you. The moment when Goku first discovers his grandfather is dead, and the story communicates it not through dramatic revelation but through absence, through a small orange sphere sitting in a place where a person used to be, and a boy who has grown up entirely alone and who carries the sphere everywhere because it is the closest thing to not alone that he has. The way Goku treats that 4-star ball across the entire original series, the care he gives it, the way he returns to it, the way he eventually wishes for his grandfather back for one afternoon and then lets him go again without argument, because the afternoon was enough, is one of the most quietly sustained pieces of emotional characterization in the series. The moment when Bulma, who has been managing this entire adventure, who built the radar and made the plans and handled the logistics and kept everyone oriented toward the goal, has her Dragon Ball stolen, the ball that matters most to her is gone, and she cries. Not the performance of crying that characters in lesser stories do when the plot requires an emotional beat, but the actual thing, someone who worked very hard for something and had it taken, and who is allowed to be upset about it without the story rushing to resolve the upset or minimize it. The story sat with Bulma's loss for a moment, and that moment was honest. The moment when Krillin won his first fight in the 21st tournament against a fighter much larger and initially much more intimidating, and the way his face looked in that panel, the specific combination of surprise and relief, and the beginning of something that would eventually become confidence. He had trained for months, he had been pushed past what he thought he could do, he had continued anyway. And then he won, in a ring, in front of people, in a way that could not be taken back. That moment was his. The story gave it to him cleanly without irony, and it was worth exactly what it cost. The moment, early in the Red Ribbon Army saga, when Goku stopped to help an old woman with her garden. The army was searching for him. He had escaped from their forces and he was technically in hiding, and he stopped to help with the garden because she asked and he saw no reason not to. This is not a plot-relevant moment. It has no consequence. It is simply a moment that tells you who Goku is, who he is when no one is watching, when there is nothing at stake, when the only reason to do a thing is that the thing needs doing and someone needs help. These moments are distributed across the original Dragon Ball-like islands in the longer passages of action and comedy, and they are what make the action and comedy mean something. You can tell that a story cares about its characters when it gives them moments that cost nothing strategically and are included anyway, simply because the character would have that moment, simply because the world would contain that moment, simply because it is true. The question of how Goku's fighting ability worked in the original series is one that was handled with a particular elegance that the later series would partially inherit and partially set aside. In the original, power was expressed not through numbers, not through the scouter readings and power levels that would become central to the Saiyan and Frieza arcs, but through what a fighter could do and how long they could do it. The measure of Goku's progress across the series was not a figure on a scale. It was demonstrated in fights, in the fact that he could take hits from Jackie Chan and keep moving, in the fact that Tien had to genuinely extend himself in their match, in the fact that his confrontation with Piccolo Daimao was recognizable as a fight between near equals, even when the outcome was in doubt. This approach had a specific effect on the reader's relationship to combat in the story. Because you could not simply compare numbers, you had to pay attention to what was actually happening in the fight, to the strategies employed, to the moments of adaptation, to the places where a fighter's specific strengths and specific limitations became visible. The fights were readable in the way that good fights are readable, as exchanges with their own grammar and logic, rather than as sequences of large numbers overcoming smaller numbers. Toriyama's genius with the original fights was in the specificity of the tactics. Goku did not win fights by simply being stronger, or rather, when he was stronger, the strength was expressed through specific technical choices rather than through raw power overwhelming resistance. He won by being observant, by recognizing patterns in opponents' behavior, by finding the precise angle or timing that a more brute force approach would have missed. His defeats had the same specificity. He lost when he was out-observed, when the pattern recognition failed, when the specific quality of the opponent's technique exceeded the specific quality of his counter. This is what made the later escalation of Dragon Ball so effective. The foundation of tactical, observant fighting was established in the original, and when the scale expanded, the tactics expanded with it. The beam struggles and the power level comparisons of Dragon Ball Z were not replacements for the original series' approach to combat. They were expressions of the same approach at a larger scale. The role of food in early Dragon Ball is not incidental, and it rewards a moment of consideration. Goku ate constantly, enormous quantities consumed with enthusiasm and without any apparent connection to social convention around mealtimes or table manners. This was, on its surface, comedy. The sheer scale of what Goku consumed was part of the running joke about his oddity, his non-humanness, the ways in which he had grown up outside ordinary social structures and so had not learned to moderate himself in the way society expects. But the eating also communicated something about Goku's relationship to the world that was not purely comedic. He was fully present in every physical experience. He was not distracted, not lost in strategy or worry or the past or the future. When he was hungry, he was hungry. When he was full, he was satisfied. When he was in a fight, he was entirely in the fight. This completeness of presence, this inability to be partially elsewhere while physically somewhere, was what made him both a perfect fighter and a slightly unusual companion. He did not maintain the social distance that most people use to manage their experiences. He was simply where he was, entirely, and the eating was one of the ways the story showed this. Sharing food was also, in the original story, a significant act. Goku shared food with people he had just met, with people he had just fought, with people who were supposed to be his enemies. He offered without calculation, received without embarrassment, and the sharing consistently accomplished something that speech would have taken longer to achieve. The seasons and landscapes of the original Dragon Ball had a presence that went beyond setting. The original manga was black and white, and Toriyama's use of tone and texture within those constraints gave the environments a variety that color would not necessarily have improved. Deserts had the weight of sand and heat communicated through the density of the ink and the specific emptiness of the sky above them. Forests had depth, layered plains of vegetation that created the sense of a world extending behind what the panel could show. Mountains were drawn with the patient specificity of someone who found landscapes interesting, who wanted the reader to understand that the world these characters moved through was actually somewhere, that it had rocks and shadows and gradients of light. The ocean, which appears relatively infrequently in the original story, but whose presence matters when it does appear, was handled with particular care. Roshi's Island, surrounded by water on all sides, had the quality of a place removed from ordinary consequence, a place where the normal rules were slightly less binding and where unusual things, the training, the cloud, the turtle, the old man in his shell, could exist without explanation. The seasons changed across the story, and the changes were felt. The warmth of the early chapters, which had the quality of late summer, gradually gave way to the cooler palette of the tournament arcs, and the northern regions Goku traveled through during the Red Ribbon Army saga had the specific chill of high altitudes and removed places. These shifts were not plot relevant, they were atmospheric. They gave the story the temporal depth of a world that continued even when the characters were not in it, a world that had weather and seasons and would continue to have them regardless of what the Dragon Ball search required. The relationship between the Dragon Balls and death in the original series established parameters that would define the moral stakes of every wish made for the rest of the franchise. The restriction that prevented the same person from being wished back more than once was not explained in terms of the Dragon Ball's magical mechanics. Shenron did not cite a rulebook. He simply said that it was not within his power. The implication was that death had a certain finality that could be overridden once, as an extraordinary exception, but that could not be overridden repeatedly without the exception itself becoming the rule. There was, in this limit, a respect for the weight of death, an acknowledgement that the most profound things in existence should not be entirely reversible, that some of what makes life meaningful is the fact that it ends. The one-year dormancy carried a similar weight. The Dragon Balls were powerful, but they were not constantly available. They were available once, in the fullness of a year's effort to gather them, and then they were gone, and the year passed, and the world carried the consequences of whatever wish had been made. The power was real, but it came with duration. It was bound by time. These constraints were not simply narrative devices, though they functioned as narrative devices. They were expressions of an underlying philosophy about the relationship between power and consequence, the idea that power which operates without limit or delay teaches a person who wields it nothing, while power that comes with genuine cost tends to be used more carefully and to leave the person who uses it more thoughtful than before. The original Dragon Ball's approach to death itself, as something that characters encountered, grieved, and eventually were allowed to reverse, had a particular rhythm that later arcs would disrupt and that the original maintained carefully. Before Krillin's death, characters in the original story did not die. They were defeated, knocked unconscious, frightened away. The villains were usually not killed. Pilaf was allowed to escape. The Red Ribbon Army soldiers who surrendered were left to their own devices. Even Commander Red's subordinate Officer Black was defeated rather than destroyed. The world of the original story was one where combat was serious but not lethal at the center, where the fighting was about something other than who survived. Krillin's death broke this pattern, and it broke it with the intent of establishing that the story had evolved. The arrival of Piccolo Daimao was the arrival of something genuinely dark, something for which the previous rules did not apply, and Krillin's death was the announcement of that change. But the announcement was made with the full weight of the change, not a throwaway death, not a minor character sacrificed to establish stakes. One of the story's most beloved figures, gone. The later restoration, The Wish That Brought Krillin Back, was handled with a similar care. It was not taken for granted. The process of gathering the Dragon Balls again was long and difficult, and the moment of the wish was given its proper weight, and Krillin's return was understood to be both a resolution and a kind of grace, something that had been earned through considerable effort, and that was not guaranteed even after the effort was made. The training sequences of the original Dragon Ball are, in aggregate, one of the most consistent pleasures of the early story, and they are worth dwelling on because of what they demonstrate about the story's attitude toward effort. Roshi's first training program, the milk delivery, the field tilling, the swimming, the carrying of shells, was structured around the principle that meaningful physical development requires duration and discomfort, that it happens slowly and that the speed of its happening is not within the control of the person doing the training. You could not rush the development by wanting it more. You could only do the work and wait. This is not a complicated observation about physical training. It is simply true, and the story honored its truth. The later training at Korin Tower was structured around the principle that meaningful development is often not what you think you are doing. Goku thought he was trying to steal water from a cat. What he was actually doing was developing the specific qualities of speed and attention and adaptive response that would make the water irrelevant. The training was happening inside the effort to take the thing, not in the taking. Korin was not teaching a technique. He was creating conditions. Both of these training philosophies appear in every martial arts tradition that has ever existed, and Toriyama encoded them in his story not because he was making a philosophical argument, but because they were the honest answer to the question of how people actually get better at things. And honoring that reality gave the training sequences a weight they would not have had if the development had been instantaneous or arbitrary. The companions Goku gathered across the original series were not all of equal narrative significance, but they all shared one quality. They were distinct. They did not blend into each other. They did not serve the same narrative function. Each of them was a different kind of person with a different kind of strength and a different kind of limitation. And the story used those differences to create variety in its situations and to allow Goku's particular qualities to be illuminated by contrast. Bulma's contrast with Goku illuminated his physical nature, the fact that he was embodied in a way that required no technology, that he could go anywhere and do anything within the range of his considerable physical abilities without equipment or planning. Her intelligence and his physicality were complements, each highlighting what the other lacked, but neither the story nor the characters themselves treated the difference as a hierarchy. Bulma's intelligence was not subordinate to Goku's strength. They were different tools for different problems. Oolong's contrast with Goku illuminated his fearlessness, the specific way that Goku moved through the world without the self-preservation instinct that governed most of Oolong's decisions. Oolong was afraid of almost everything, and watching him interact with Goku, who was afraid of almost nothing, clarified both qualities. Oolong's fear was comprehensible and sometimes correct. Goku's fearlessness was extraordinary and sometimes naive. The truth of how to move through the world was somewhere in between them. Yamcha's contrast with Goku illuminated his uncomplicated relationship with other people, the fact that Goku engaged directly and without reserve, while Yamcha was perpetually managing the gap between how he presented himself and how he actually felt. Goku never had this gap. What he was, he showed. The absence of self-presentation in Goku threw into relief how much of Yamcha's energy went into it. Krillin's contrast with Goku was the most intimate of all, because Krillin was the first person outside of family who Goku genuinely loved, and the contrast between them, the ordinary human and the extraordinary one, was what the story used to establish exactly how extraordinary the extraordinary one was, without ever making that extraordinariness feel like superiority. Krillin was not less than Goku. He was different from Goku. The distinction was real, and the story maintained it. Akira Toriyama's relationship with his editor during the Dragon Ball run is one of the better documented aspects of the series production, and it illuminates the collaborative nature of the story's development in ways that are useful to understand. His editor at Shonen Jump during the early years of Dragon Ball was Kazuhiko Torishima, and their relationship was, by Toriyama's own account, one of significant creative friction that Toriyama has consistently credited with improving the story. Torishima pushed back on character designs, on story directions, on the pacing of arcs. He wanted more, and different, and better, and his insistence generated a productive resistance in Toriyama that the work benefited from. The character of Bulma, for instance, was redesigned multiple times before the first chapter was published, with Torishima pushing for a design that was both more expressive and more immediately communicative of her personality. The versions that were rejected are preserved in Toriyama's supplementary materials, and they are instructive. They are technically accomplished, but they lack the specific quality of aliveness that the final design achieved. The friction produced the better version. This dynamic, editor as productive resistance rather than merely responsive approval, was part of the Shonen Jump model that generated many of the most enduring manga of the 1980s and 90s. And Dragon Ball was shaped by it as directly as any of its contemporaries. The story that exists is not simply Toriyama's vision. It is the result of Toriyama's vision meeting a particular set of institutional pressures and expectations. And the meeting was, on the whole, generative. The specific details of the world's geography in the original Dragon Ball were never fully mapped, but the impression of the world was consistent enough that it felt from the inside like a real place. Capsule Corporation, Bulma's family's company, had made a specific kind of technology ubiquitous. The capsule, a small cylinder that contained compressed versions of objects, vehicles, houses, equipment that could be released at need and recalled just as easily. This technology had transformed how people traveled and carried things, and its presence in the story created a world where the infrastructure of travel and supply was radically different from anything analogous to the real world. You could carry your house in your pocket, your boat fit in your hand. The logistics of adventure, normally a grinding background concern, were simply removed by invention. This had a specific narrative effect. It meant that the story could move freely between locations, without spending any time on the mechanics of the movement. Goku and Bulma could be somewhere remote, and then, when the story needed them elsewhere, they simply capsulized their vehicle and went. The world was made navigable by technology, and navigability created the possibility of the wide, wandering structure that characterized the early arcs. It also established Bulma's family as one of the more significant presences in the story's world. The Brief family, who ran Capsule Corporation and who lived in a compound in the city that would eventually be called West City, were among the most powerful and influential people in the Dragon Ball world without ever being fighters. Their influence was infrastructural. They had made the world more connected and more manageable, and everyone in the story benefited from it, even if they didn't always notice. The moments of genuine peace in the original Dragon Ball are as carefully constructed as the moments of conflict, and they are, in some ways, more revealing. The early chapters between adventures, the brief periods when Goku was simply living, eating, training, moving through a world that was not currently demanding anything particular of him, had a specific quality of contentment. He was not restless in the way that many action heroes are restless, not pacing and waiting for the next fight. He was simply at rest, occupied with whatever was immediately in front of him, and the rest was genuine. This quality was not natural to the genre he inhabited. Battle manga, almost by definition, structure their heroes around conflict, around the absence of peace as the driver of action, and the achievement of peace as a goal always deferred past the next villain. Toriyama did something different. He built a hero who was genuinely at peace in the intervals between conflicts, who did not experience the peace as absence but as presence, who could be still. This made Goku unusual in the genre, and also made the conflicts mean more, because they were disruptions of something real, rather than interruptions of a waiting that was itself a kind of suffering. The theme of legacy, of what is passed down and what is built, runs through the original Dragon Ball story more consistently than is sometimes noticed. Roshi had received his training from someone, and his training methods were both a continuation of what he had been given and an adaptation of it to what he had learned in decades of practice. He passed those methods to Goku and Krillin, imperfectly and with adjustments, adding to the tradition and subtracting from it in ways that were appropriate to the specific students and the specific moment. The chain of transmission was not preserved unchanged, it was alive. Gohan had raised Goku with values, kindness, curiosity, the belief that the world was interesting and worth engaging with fully, that Goku carried forward without knowing he was carrying them forward. He had not been given a doctrine, he had been given a way of being through years of daily example, and the way of being had become simply who he was. This is how the most durable legacies actually work, not through explicit instruction, but through sustained presence, through the modeling of a life that someone else inhabits long enough to make it their own. The Dragon Balls themselves were a legacy in the most literal sense, an inheritance from Kami, passed to the world carrying the power and the limitations of their origin. They could not exceed what Kami was. They could not do what Kami could not do. They were, at their root, an expression of his capacity, not an amplification of it. And the story that Toriyama built in the original Dragon Ball was itself a legacy, a foundation for everything that came after, a set of characters and relationships and philosophical commitments that the later series inherited and built upon, sometimes wisely and sometimes less so, but always with that foundation beneath them. The night is full, and the story is long, and the Dragon Balls are somewhere out in the world tonight, scattered and waiting and holding the light of 7 different stars. Somewhere a boy is riding a cloud above mountains he has always loved, over forests and deserts and oceans that he knows the way you know things you have moved through with your whole body. And the sky is very wide and very dark and full of the kind of quiet that only belongs to high places. The 4-star ball is in his pocket, warm from being carried. He does not need to hold it. He does not need to look at it. He knows it is there, and that is enough. Bulma is probably inventing something. Krillin is probably training, or eating, or both. Roshi is on his island, watching the ocean, thinking thoughts that are his own. Piccolo is somewhere in a landscape he is just beginning to recognize as the world rather than the territory he was made to take. The Ox King's mountain has cooled and the fire is gone, and the road to his gate is clear. Everything is as it is. The world is whole. And yet there is more to be said. There is always more to be said about a story this wide and this carefully made. So let the night continue a little longer, and the telling continue with it, and the world of the original Dragon Ball open a little further into the quiet dark. The original Dragon Ball manga ran for 519 chapters across its full length, though the portion that most people identify as the original Dragon Ball, before the transition into what would later be rebranded as Dragon Ball Z, comprises approximately 194 of those chapters. That first portion, the one this story dwells in, contained within its pages a complete world with its own logic and its own values and its own particular understanding of what a story was for. Toriyama drew every one of those chapters himself. This is worth understanding in its concrete reality. Weekly Shonen Jump was published every week, which meant that Toriyama was delivering a new chapter of Dragon Ball to his editors approximately every 7 to 10 days, depending on the production cycle and the demands of any given week. He was doing this while also handling revisions and corrections and the ongoing development of the story's direction. The pressure was continuous and real, and it was the same pressure that shaped the careers of every mangaka who worked within that system. The weekly schedule created specific conditions for the story's development. It meant that Toriyama could not sit with a chapter for months before delivering it. It meant that decisions made in one week had to be honored in the next, because the previous week's chapter was already in print and in the hands of readers. It meant that the story had to be good enough, consistently enough, under conditions that made consistency difficult. The original Dragon Ball met that standard week after week for years, and the cumulative weight of that consistency is part of what gave the series its particular authority. There were weeks when Toriyama was not satisfied with what he had drawn. He has said so in interviews. There were chapters that felt to him like they were not as good as the chapters surrounding them. But the schedule did not wait for satisfaction, and the imperfect chapters were published, and readers loved them anyway, and the story continued. This is not an argument against standards. It is an observation about the relationship between craft and time, and about the way that something made under pressure can still be made with love, and that the love shows even when the pressure does too. The character of Goku's grandfather, Gohan, the original Gohan, the human man who raised the Saiyan child he found in the forest, is one of the original Dragon Ball's most important absent presences. He died before the story began. He was never shown in the main narrative except in flashback and in the single extraordinary afternoon that Baba permitted him. And yet his influence on the story is visible in every chapter, because Goku is entirely his work. The person Goku became, the values he held, the way he treated people, the specific quality of his kindness, was the direct result of one old man deciding to raise the strange, dangerous child he had found, and to raise him well. Gohan had been a student of Roshi's, which meant he was part of the Turtle School lineage, which meant that what he gave Goku was not only love, but the martial arts tradition that would define Goku's entire life. He gave Goku fighting. He gave Goku kindness. He gave him the 4-star bowl and the memory of how the bowl was held. He gave him the mountains and the forests and the particular education of growing up in a place where everything is real, where the rain is real and the cold is real and the fish you catch for dinner is the fish you eat for dinner. He gave him a life that asked for full attention, and Goku gave that attention fully to everything ever after. The absence of Gohan from the living story created a specific kind of gravity in the narrative. He was the reason the 4-star ball mattered. He was the reason Goku kept searching for it, even after the Dragon Ball search became about something larger. He was the reason Goku prayed before his meals in the way that Bulma saw in that early chapter, and that moved her more than she expected to be moved. The dead can be enormously present in a story that understands what they left behind. The Turtle School uniform deserves more consideration than it typically receives, because the kanji that Goku wore on his gi was not decorative. It was instructional. The character on the back of Goku's uniform during the early series was the kanji for turtle, Kame, identifying him as a student of the Kame Sennin, the turtle hermit, which was Roshi's formal title. This was a tradition in Toriyama's world, as in actual martial arts traditions. Students wore their school on their bodies. They were identifiable. When they fought as representatives of their lineage, and what they did reflected on everyone who had trained in that lineage before them. Goku's later adoption of the kanji for king, which he wore when he had surpassed Roshi's direct instruction and was developing his own identity as a fighter, marked a specific transition in his relationship to the tradition he had been given. He was no longer only a student. He was something that had grown from the student into its own shape. The uniform changed to reflect this, and the change was visible, and it mattered in ways that were small on the surface and significant underneath. Chi-Chi wore her own family's markings. The Ox King had trained under Roshi as well, which meant Chi-Chi grew up in a household shaped by the same lineage, different in its particulars but connected at its root. The fact that Goku and Chi-Chi both came from the Turtle School's extended world was not plot relevant in any strict sense, but it was part of the story's texture, the sense of a world where the important things were connected in ways that took time to see. The 21st Tournament saga moved through its early rounds quickly, and most of the fighters who appeared in those rounds were sketched rather than fully drawn. Figures who existed to demonstrate the range of fighting styles that existed in the world, and to give Goku and Krillin context for their own level of development. A fighter who had trained for decades in a specific regional style. A massive man whose strength was real but whose technique had never been refined. A fighter who relied entirely on a single devastating technique and had never considered what to do when that technique was countered. These early round fighters were not mocked. Toriyama did not treat them as fodder with contempt. They were people who had committed to something and who were confronting the limits of that commitment in the context of a competition that included people who had committed to something more complete. The losses were losses, not humiliations. The story acknowledged that everyone in that tournament had earned their place in it, even the ones who left in the early rounds. The audience for the tournament was drawn with similar care. They were not a faceless mass. They had faces and expressions and the specific quality of attention that people bring to watching something they have paid to watch, something they have traveled to see, something that has their full investment for this particular afternoon. Toriyama's crowds were alive. They responded to what happened in the ring with the reactions of people who were genuinely watching, and their reactions gave the fights a context that isolated action sequences could not have had. The commentator who announced the tournament matches had a role that was both practical, explaining to both the in-story audience and the reader what was happening technically, and atmospheric. His voice structured the tournament. He gave it ceremony. His announcements marked the beginning and end of things in ways that made those beginnings and endings feel consequential. And his periodic eruptions of genuine surprise and admiration when the fights went beyond what he had expected were an honest barometer of the story's stakes. The relationship between Goku and the natural world is one of the original Dragon Ball's most consistent background themes, and it runs through the story so quietly and so thoroughly that it can be easy to miss if you are not specifically looking for it. Goku grew up in the mountains, not near the mountains, in them. His home was in the forest, and the forest was not backdrop, it was neighbor. He knew the animals by name, or if not by name then by habit, by the patterns of their movement through the seasons, by the places they went when the weather changed. He fished in the river and ate what he caught. He slept outside when the weather permitted and inside when it did not, and the difference between inside and outside was not the difference between safe and unsafe. It was simply the difference between two conditions of living in the world. This relationship shaped how he moved through the urban and semi-urban environments the story carried him through. He was not uncomfortable in towns. He was not hostile to them, but he was clearly someone for whom built environments were a kind of accommodation, a way of visiting, rather than the natural condition of existence. He moved through cities with the attentiveness of someone reading an unfamiliar landscape, noting what the landscape required and responding to it without the automatic ease that comes from having grown up there. His relationship with animals was direct and without hierarchy. He did not think of animals as lesser. He had grown up among them as a member of the natural community rather than its sovereign, and this orientation persisted in the way he responded to the creatures the story occasionally placed in his path. He helped them when they needed help. He ate them when he was hungry, and that was what was available. He did not conflate these two responses because they were not in conflict. Both were honest engagements with the world as it was. The flying nimbus was, in some sense, the natural world giving him back what he had given it. A cloud that would carry only the pure-hearted was a cloud that responded to the quality of a person's engagement with the world around them. Goku had lived in full and honest relationship with the world from the beginning of his life, and the world, through the intermediary of Roshi's unusual gift, extended that relationship into a mode of travel. He could not have earned the cloud through fighting. He earned it by being who he was. The city of Penguin Village, where Goku's path briefly crossed with the world of Dr. Slump, was built with a specific internal logic of Toriyama's earlier creative landscape. Dr. Slump ran for 18 volumes and 243 chapters, and in that space Toriyama had developed a village populated by characters whose comic sensibility was distinct from anything in Dragon Ball. More surreal, more focused on absurdity for its own sake, less interested in the underlying seriousness that Dragon Ball always maintained beneath its comedy. Penguin Village was a place where a robot girl could sneeze a hole through a brick wall and where the police officers were more likely to be the cause of chaos than its solution, and where the laws of physics were, more like guidelines than requirements. When Goku arrived in this village, he arrived as a foreigner, not an uncomfortable one. Nothing made Goku uncomfortable, but a visitor from a story with different rules. And the village received him with the cheerful indifference of a place that had seen enough strange things, that one more strange thing was simply interesting rather than alarming. The interaction between the two worlds was brief and light, and full of the specific pleasure of a creator playing in adjacent gardens, letting his characters peek over the fence at each other. Ariel's response to Goku was the most honest response possible. She was delighted. She had no idea who he was, or where he came from, or what his story involved, and she did not need to. He was interesting, and she wanted to play with him, and so she did for a little while, before the stories separated again and each character returned to their own world. The Penguin Village detour was not essential to the Dragon Ball narrative. Nothing that happened there had consequences in the larger story. But it was a moment of pure creative joy, unmotivated by plot requirement, present only because Toriyama wanted it there, and because it was true to both worlds to allow this brief overlap. Moments of pure creative joy, unmotivated by structural necessity, are among the clearest expressions of a creator's genuine affection for what they are making. The Red Ribbon Army's technology represented the most advanced military capability in the world of early Dragon Ball, and its particulars were carefully considered. The Army's vehicles were distinct, flying platforms and specialized aircraft and armored vehicles that felt genuinely military without resembling any specific real-world equivalent. Toriyama had an affection for mechanical design that was visible throughout his career, and the Red Ribbon vehicles had the quality of objects that someone had thought through completely. Not just how they looked, but how they would be used, what their strengths and limitations were, how a pilot or driver would interact with them. They felt functional rather than decorative. The Army's communication technology, the radios and surveillance equipment and coordination systems that allowed a force spread across the globe to operate as a coherent organization, was another of the original story's quiet achievements. Most of the Red Ribbon Army's operations depended on this infrastructure, and the story acknowledged it consistently. Commanders received reports. Orders were transmitted. The intelligence that drove the Army's search for the Dragon Balls was gathered and processed in ways that felt like an actual intelligence operation, scaled to the world's particular physics. This grounding gave the Red Ribbon Army a weight that simpler antagonist organizations often lack. They were not just powerful people who needed to be defeated. They were a system, with the strengths and vulnerabilities of a system, and the way Goku moved through them, not systematically dismantling their infrastructure, but simply moving in a direction that happened to intersect with their operations repeatedly until the operations could no longer accommodate his existence, was a natural expression of who he was. He was not a strategist. He did not set out to defeat an organization. He set out to find something, and the organization kept being in the way. Dr. Brief, Bulma's father, the scientist who had founded Capsule Corporation and who lived in the sprawling compound that served as the Brief family home, appears only rarely in the original story, but his presence in it has a specific quality worth noting. He was cheerful, distracted, and deeply absorbed in his work in ways that made him largely oblivious to the remarkable events occurring around his family. He built and modified technology with the same comfortable ease that most people applied to making breakfast. His workshop was full of projects in various stages of completion, and he moved through them with the patient enthusiasm of someone who had long ago stopped distinguishing between work and interest because for him they were the same thing. He is, in many ways, the model from whom Bulma inherited the most important parts of herself. Not his distraction. Bulma was, if anything, more sharply focused on the world around her than her father ever was. But the ease with difficulty, the assumption that complicated problems were interesting rather than daunting, the readiness to begin building before the full shape of the solution was clear, trusting the building process to reveal the shape. These were his gifts to her, transmitted through years of watching him work, and they were among the most useful gifts she could have received. The arc of Goku's physical development across the original series is one of the things the story handled with the most care and the most patience. At the story's beginning, Goku was small. He was strong by any ordinary measure, enormously, almost incomprehensibly strong for his size and age. But he was visually a child, and the story used that visual to establish a specific relationship between his appearance and the assumptions others made about him. People who saw him for the first time consistently underestimated him. This was not because they were foolish. It was because he looked like a child, and children are not supposed to be able to do what Goku could do, and the human mind naturally trusts its eyes. As the series progressed, Goku grew. The growth was gradual and realistic in the way that manga time can be realistic. He was visibly older in the Tournament Saga than he had been in the Pilaf Saga, visibly older still in the Red Ribbon Army arc, and by the time of the 23rd tournament, he had become recognizably a young man rather than a child. The orange gi fit differently. The face had changed. The body had the shape of someone who had spent years in serious physical training, not the compact roundness of early childhood. This physical development was not just visual. It was accompanied by the development of his fighting style, which became more refined as the series continued. The early Goku fought largely on instinct and raw ability. The later Goku fought with technique and awareness, with the ability to read opponents and respond to patterns, with a tactical intelligence that had been developed through years of competition and training. He was still instinctive, that never entirely left him, but the instincts were now backed by knowledge, and the combination was formidable in ways that pure instinct never could have been. Krillin's introduction to the story was not entirely flattering, and Toriyama's willingness to introduce a future beloved character this way reflects a confidence in what the character would eventually become. He arrived at Kame House with magazines for Roshi to sign and an attitude that could charitably be described as opportunistic. He was pushy, he was somewhat manipulative. He had come to train with Roshi not out of pure passion for martial arts, but out of a desire to impress girls at his former school. And the transparency of this motivation was played entirely for honest comedy rather than for sympathy. He was, in his first appearance, not particularly likable, but the training changed him, or rather the training revealed him. The person who emerged from months of serious physical development was not the person who had arrived at the island. Not because the training had changed his fundamental character. He remained competitive and occasionally calculating and deeply focused on what other people thought of him, but because it had given him something to be genuinely proud of, and genuine pride tends to reduce the need for the defensive behaviors that were masking it. His relationship with Goku developed across those training months in the specific way that training partnerships develop, through shared exhaustion, shared frustration, shared small victories that only the two of them fully understood because only the two of them had been there for the work that preceded them. They competed consistently and genuinely, and the competition was honest because both of them cared about it, and the honesty of the caring was the foundation of the friendship that the competition kept refreshing. The Daisen-Shu guidebooks, official encyclopedic references for the Dragon Ball franchise published by Shueisha, contain supplementary information about the original series that fills in details the manga did not have room to explain. The guidebooks confirm, for instance, that Goku was 3 years old when he arrived on Earth, and that he was found and taken in by Grandpa Gohan shortly afterward. They establish the formal timeline of the story, giving dates to events that the manga presented in relative rather than absolute terms. They document the power levels, the scouter readings, of characters from the original series, providing a numerical framework for the relative strengths that the story had communicated through fights and outcomes. They also contain interviews with Toriyama and other key figures in the franchise, and these interviews illuminate the creative process behind the original story in ways that the work itself cannot. Toriyama's discussion of how he developed the tournament format, of how he approached the design of specific characters, of the decisions that were made and unmade and made again as the story took shape, these conversations are the closest thing available to a direct account of what it was like to be inside the making of Dragon Ball. The Daiyenshu also document the anime adaptation's departures from the manga, which in the original Dragon Ball series were generally minor compared to what would occur in Dragon Ball Z. The anime mostly followed the manga closely with the expansion that adaptation always requires, adding music and voice and motion and color to things that existed previously only in black ink on paper, but without the significant addition of filler arcs that would characterize the Z period. The filler material that the original Dragon Ball anime did include was, for the most part, consistent with the spirit of the source material in ways that later filler sometimes was not. Filler in this context means episodes or sequences that existed in the anime but had no corresponding material in the manga, content created by the animation studio to maintain the weekly broadcast schedule when the anime was in danger of catching up to the still ongoing manga. In the original Dragon Ball series, this filler was relatively sparse, and when it appeared, it tended to take the form of brief adventure sequences that felt like extended versions of the wandering episodic structure the manga itself had used. A Goku who stopped to help someone between major story beats, a brief encounter with a new character in a location the manga had not visited, a scene that elaborated on a relationship the manga had sketched quickly. These expansions were not always inspired, but they were not inconsistent, and the best of them had the quality of genuine additions, things that felt like they belonged in the world even if they had not originated in Toriyama's pen. The anime also added what the manga could not have: music, which gave the world a sonic identity distinct from anything the visual medium alone could provide, and voice, which gave the characters a dimension of personality that even Toriyama's expressive art could only imply. These additions were, in aggregate, enormous. They are the reason Dragon Ball is, for most of its global audience, a multimedia experience rather than a reading experience, and the quality of those additions was sufficient to make the transition feel like a completion rather than a dilution. Among the many things the original Dragon Ball established that would carry forward through the entire franchise was its approach to rivalry. Goku had rivals before he had friends. Yamcha was a rival before he was an ally. Tien was a rival before he was anything else. Piccolo was introduced as an enemy and became, over time, something for which the usual categories were insufficient. The pattern of antagonist to ally through the medium of genuine competition was not unique to Dragon Ball, but Dragon Ball used it with a specific consistency and a specific understanding of what the pattern meant. The transformation from rival to ally in the original series was never simply a matter of the rival losing. Losing was the beginning of the process, not the end. What mattered was what the rival did with the loss. Did they rage against it, insisting that the result was wrong? Did they accept it while maintaining contempt for the person who had beaten them? Or did they sit with the loss and find in it something informative, something that told them about themselves and about the person who had defeated them, that was worth knowing? The rivals who became allies were the ones who sat with the loss honestly. Yamcha sat with his loss to Goku in the desert and found in it the beginning of a genuine curiosity about this strange boy and what he represented. Tien sat with his tournament losses and found in them the first evidence that the framework he had been given for understanding strength was incomplete. Piccolo, eventually, across years, sat with the loss to Goku in the 23rd tournament and found in it something that changed the entire shape of who he was. Rivalry in the original Dragon Ball was not conflict. It was education conducted at the level of full physical and mental engagement. The rivals taught each other by fighting things that could not have been taught any other way. The question of why Goku never used the Kamehameha in the Pilaf saga, why in fact he did not use it until much later in the original story, is one that reveals something important about how Toriyama managed the development of his protagonist's abilities. Goku learned the Kamehameha by watching Roshi demonstrate it once. He imitated the motion and produced the technique, to Roshi's considerable astonishment. This was established as an expression of Goku's extraordinary natural gift for physical learning, His ability to watch something and immediately replicate the movement that produced it, even in a case where the technique had taken Roshi 50 years to develop, but the technique was powerful and the story was careful about when and how it was deployed. In the early chapters before the tournament, before Roshi's training, Goku's fighting was physical and direct, punching, kicking, grappling, using the environment. The energy-based techniques came later, were introduced gradually, and were treated as significant events when they appeared. The first time Goku used the Kamehameha in a serious fight was a moment, not a footnote. The story had been building toward it, and when it arrived it was consequential. This management of ability introduction is one of the things that made early Dragon Ball so well paced. Goku never seemed to be holding abilities in reserve for dramatic convenience. Instead, the story was built around a genuine sequence of development. Abilities introduced as they were acquired, used as they were mastered, expanded as the training expanded. The power escalation was always the result of something, never simply the answer to a problem that required escalation. The Kamehameha itself, that drawing back and pushing forward, that gathering of concentrated energy and release, became one of the most iconic techniques in all of animation, reproduced and referenced and parodied and loved across decades, in part because its visual design was so clear and so complete. You understood exactly what was happening when you saw it. The preparation was visible. The release was visible. The effect was proportionate to the preparation in ways that made physical sense. It was a technique that looked like it worked. The question of power in the original Dragon Ball was handled through demonstration rather than through declaration, and this had a specific effect on how readers understood the story's world. When the story needed to establish that someone was strong, it showed them doing something difficult. When it needed to establish that they were stronger than someone else, it showed the fight. The hierarchy of power was earned through performance rather than through announcement, which meant that when a power level was implied by the story's events, it was implied by something the reader had witnessed directly. This approach had consequences for the reader's relationship to surprise. Because power was established through demonstration, it was genuinely possible to be surprised by what someone could do. You did not have a number to anchor your expectations. You had only what you had seen, and what you had seen was bounded by the specific circumstances of the fights you had witnessed. A fighter who had won impressively in one context might encounter someone in a different context who operated from an entirely different framework, and the surprise would be real. The later introduction of the Scouter and the power level system in Dragon Ball Z was a deliberate departure from this approach, and it served different narrative purposes, creating a scaffolding for the enormous escalation of that series, providing a vocabulary for characters to discuss their relative capabilities, but in doing so, it changed the reader's relationship to power. Numbers tend to anchor expectations, and anchored expectations reduce the possibility of genuine surprise. The original Dragon Ball's numberless approach to power was one of the things that gave it a particular quality of unpredictability that the later series, for all its pleasures, did not fully recapture. The annual World Martial Arts tournaments were, within the world of Dragon Ball, the premier competitive event in a culture that valued martial arts highly. The original story treated the tournament as a genuine institution, something with history, with tradition, with a public and an infrastructure and an established set of rules that the competitors and the organizers both took seriously. The Tenkaichi Budokai had been running for years before Goku and Krillin entered it for the first time. There were people who had trained their entire lives to compete in it. There were crowds who had attended every tournament they could reach, who knew the history and the previous winners and the legendary fights that had taken place in that ring. This institutional weight gave the tournament a significance that the fights within it could draw on. When Goku and Jackie Chan met in the finals of the 21st tournament, the fight was not only about the two of them, it was about a ring that had hosted countless finals before it, about a tradition of competition that both of them were entering as its newest representatives. The crowd's response to the fight was the response of people who understood what they were watching, who had a context for it, who could appreciate the quality of what was happening, because they had been watching this event for long enough to know what it looked like when something exceptional was occurring. The fact that the 21st tournament was won by Jackie Chun, by an old man in a wig, was itself a statement about the tournament's tradition. The established fighters, the ones who had been competing for years, were not easily displaced by newcomers, however talented. There were decades of skill in that ring, and the newcomers who entered it had to earn their place not just against the specific fighters they faced, but against the accumulated weight of the tradition itself. The weather during the Red Ribbon Army arc had a specific quality that added to the saga's atmosphere in ways that are easy to undervalue. The northern regions where Muscle Tower stood were cold in the way that high latitudes are cold. Not dramatically cold, not the exaggerated cold of a story that wants to make a point about hardship, but simply and consistently cold in the way that winter in a remote place is simply and consistently cold. The environment required nothing particular of Goku. He moved through it without complaint, but it was there, present in the visual texture of the chapters, in the way the snow lay on the ground, and the way the steam of warm breath was visible in the outdoor scenes. The cold was a condition of the world, not a dramatic device. The desert regions through which Yamcha had moved and through which the army also operated had a different texture, dry, open, with a specific quality of exposure that desert landscapes carry. You could see a long way in any direction, which meant that the encounters that occurred in those spaces had a different visual logic than encounters in forests or cities. There was nowhere to hide. The scale of the confrontations was visible from a distance. These environmental textures were part of what gave the original Dragon Ball its sense of genuine geography, the feeling that the world had regions with distinct characters, that moving from one to another involved a real transition, that the world was not simply a neutral stage on which events occurred, but an active participant in the quality of those events. The philosophical tradition behind the Turtle School fighting style is suggested in the original series more than it is stated, but what is suggested is consistent and specific. Roshi's teaching was built around the idea that martial arts were not primarily a means of defeating opponents, they were a means of developing the person who practiced them. This distinction sounds simple, but it had significant practical implications for how the training was designed and what the training measured. A style built around defeating opponents would optimize for effectiveness against specific kinds of opponents in specific kinds of situations. It would teach techniques calibrated to current combat conditions and designed to produce victories against the fighters one was likely to face. It would be useful and it would be limited. A style built around developing the practitioner would optimize for qualities, speed, awareness, adaptability, endurance, the ability to perform under pressure, the capacity to continue when continuing was difficult, that were applicable in any situation, against any opponent, under any conditions. It would be less immediately tactical and more deeply useful, because the qualities it developed were genuine rather than situational. Roshi's method was the second kind, and the milk delivery training and the field work and the swimming were all expressions of it. He was not teaching techniques. He was developing people. The techniques were part of that development, but they were downstream of the qualities that made the techniques possible, and the qualities came first. This philosophy was visible in how his students fought. Goku and Krillin did not fight with a recognizable Turtle School style in the way that a student of a specific technical tradition might be expected to. They fought with the qualities the training had developed, the speed, the endurance, the adaptability, expressed through whatever techniques each of them had developed as their own. The style was internalized to the point of invisibility, which is what it looks like when a teaching has actually worked. The original Dragon Ball's treatment of wishes and their consequences is one of the story's most quietly sophisticated elements, and it runs deeper than the rules Shenron stated. Every wish in the original series had a cost. Not a cost that Shenron imposed. The dragon simply granted what was asked, within his ability to grant it, and that was the end of his involvement. The costs were carried by the people who made the wishes and who had to live with what the wishes meant. Pilaf's wish was interrupted. which meant that Pilaf lived with the failure of his life's ambition for the duration of the story's run, that he continued in his castle doing nothing in particular while the world moved on around him. This was not dramatic. It was simply the continuation of his situation, which the wish was supposed to resolve and which his own poor planning had prevented from resolving. He wanted things, and he had no one to blame but himself. Piccolo Daimao's wish for youth was granted, and it came with its own particular weight. The youth that the wish restored was the youth of a being whose purpose was destruction, whose power had originally been concentrated in one direction and had then been divided and diminished over centuries. The restored youth was, in its way, a restoration of a threat that the world had spent considerable time and effort containing. The wish accomplished exactly what Piccolo asked for, and exactly what the world feared, and the cost of it was measured in the events that followed. The wishes that restored the dead were made by people who had lost specific beloved individuals and who made the wishes with full knowledge of what they were asking for and why. These wishes were different in texture from the others, less about personal ambition and more about the simple, honest desire to undo a loss that felt unbearable. Their cost was not dramatic consequence, but the more quiet cost of acknowledging that the loss had been real enough to require the full effort of gathering 7 Dragon Balls to address. There is a particular rhythm to the original Dragon Ball's chapter structure that rewards attention. Most chapters began in the middle of an ongoing situation, rather than at a narrative pause. Toriyama did not typically give his readers the equivalent of a scene break, a moment of explicit transition between one event and the next. Instead, chapters picked up where the previous one had left off, creating a sense of continuous momentum in which the boundaries between chapters were felt less as interruptions and more as resting points within a flow that did not entirely stop. This was a deliberate craft choice, and it served the story well. It created the sense that the world was always in motion, that events were happening continuously whether or not they were being observed, that the story was a selection from an ongoing stream rather than the sequence of discrete episodes. The character existed between the panels as well as within them. The chapters also ended in specific ways, not always on cliffhangers in the traditional sense, but on moments that created forward momentum. A reveal, a question, a new element introduced in the final panels that recontextualized what had come before or indicated clearly what was coming next. The endings pulled you forward while the beginnings were still orienting you, and the combination created a reading rhythm that was genuinely difficult to stop once established. This structural craft was invisible when it worked, which it usually did. The reader felt the momentum without necessarily analyzing its source. They turned the page because the story made them want to turn the page, and the wanting felt natural rather than manufactured. The question of how the Dragon Balls were scattered after each wish has never been exhaustively explained in the original series, and the ambiguity was deliberate. Shenron granted the wish and then the balls scattered. Where they went was not predictable. They ended up in lakes, in caves, in cities, in the hands of people who found them and attributed all kinds of significance to them. Good luck charms, decorations, objects of mysterious beauty whose properties were not known to the people who carried them. The scattering was random in the way that important things are sometimes random. Not meaningless, but not patterned in any way that could be anticipated. This unpredictability served the story structurally by ensuring that each search was genuinely new. The group could not go back to the places they had found balls before. The radar would lead them somewhere different, and the somewhere different would be a place they had not been, containing people they had not met, presenting circumstances they had not encountered. The scattering was the story's engine for discovery, and the randomness of the scattering preserved the freshness of what the discovery found. The dragon himself was a figure of ancient patience, and the scattering was performed with the indifference of something very old and very large doing something very small. He granted the wish, and he returned to the balls, and they dispersed, and he was gone, and the sky cleared, and the world was as it had been before the balls were gathered. Except that one thing had changed because someone had wanted it to change enough to spend what it cost. The closing chapters of the original Dragon Ball, the ones that brought the 23rd tournament to its conclusion, and set up the transition into what would become Dragon Ball Z were written with the awareness that something was ending and something was beginning, and they carried that awareness in their texture. Goku's victory over Piccolo was a complete victory, but Toriyama was careful not to make it a total one. Piccolo survived. This was not a plot convenience. It was a choice with specific meaning. The story was leaving room. Not room for Piccolo specifically to return as a villain, though events would give him that opportunity before his eventual redemption, but room in the larger sense, the sense that the world was not finished simply because the immediate threat had been addressed. There was always more in the world. There was always something ahead. The 3-year time skip that had preceded the tournament was itself a statement about the story's confidence in its own temporal dimension. Toriyama had told his readers that time passed, that people grew and changed in ways that were worth trusting without witnessing directly. He gave them an older Goku and trusted that they would understand how he had gotten there, because the story had shown them, in everything that came before, what Goku did with time that was given to him. Chi-Chi was there, and the marriage that followed the tournament was presented as the natural completion of something that had been set in motion years before. In the offhand promise of a boy who did not understand what he was promising, the completion was right. The timing was right. The story knew when it was done with the things it had set out to do, and it ended them with the same unhurried honesty that had characterized them from the beginning. And still the night is deep, and the story has more to offer, and the Dragon Balls are scattered and patient, and the world they made possible is unchanged by the lateness of the hour. The 4-star ball is warm, always warm, the way objects that are carried with love become warm. It does not do anything. It does not need to. It is simply itself, present, held. The mountains are where they have always been. The forest makes the sounds it makes at this hour. The sounds of water and wind and the small movements of animals going about their lives without reference to any story being told about them, because their lives are not stories. They are simply lives, and they are occurring right now in the same world where Goku once lived and where everything that followed from that living is still unfolding. Let the world do what it does while you rest. It does not need your attention to continue. The Dragon Balls will be where they are. The cloud will be where it is. The characters you love are where they have always been, in the panels and pages of a story built with patience and care and genuine affection, waiting for the next time you open to them. The story began with 2 characters meeting in the mountains, and it has never stopped beginning. Every reading is the first reading for someone. Every time someone finds that first chapter and reads about a small boy holding a strange car over his head and waiting for it to do something threatening, something starts. A connection to a world that took decades to build and that has been offering itself patiently and completely to everyone who has come looking. You found it. You are in it now. And now it is time to rest and to let the story continue in whatever dreams come, and to know that it will be here tomorrow, exactly as it was today, patient and whole and entirely itself. Still the night holds, and there is more. The world that Toriyama built is wide enough to walk through for a very long time, and the walking is its own reward. The great ape transformation, the Uzaru form that Goku could enter under the light of a full moon, was one of the original Dragon Ball's most important structural elements, and it functioned in the story in ways that are more nuanced than its dramatic spectacle might suggest. The transformation was not voluntary. Goku could not choose to become the great ape and could not choose to leave the form once entered. The trigger was entirely external, the moon, present or absent, illuminating a night that he could not control. And the Goku who existed inside the form had no memory of being there afterward. He would wake human, surrounded by destruction he could not account for, in a body that had done things his ordinary self would never have done. This involuntary quality was essential to how the transformation functioned narratively. It was not a power that Goku controlled. It was a power that controlled him, one of the few aspects of his nature that was entirely outside his agency. For a character defined by his extraordinary competence and his full engagement with every situation he encountered, the great ape was the exception, the thing that happened to him rather than the thing he did. It was, in its way, the story's acknowledgement that even Goku was not entirely his own. The great ape was also the first clear signal that Goku was not human, offered to the reader long before the Saiyan explanation existed to make sense of it. A human child does not transform into a giant ape under a full moon. A human does not have a tail. A human does not experience involuntary transformation of any kind. These details were in the story from nearly the beginning, available to be read as signals, and the story trusted the reader to hold them, to notice that something was unusual, to wonder about it, to carry the question forward through the chapters without requiring an immediate answer. The eventual revelation that Goku was the last surviving member of a warrior alien race was prepared by all of this, and the preparation was honest. The transformation, the tail, the landing pod that Roshi eventually found, these were not retconned details. They were planted specifics, pieces of a truth that Toriyama was constructing carefully and revealing only when the structure was ready to hold the weight of the revelation. The original Dragon Ball supporting cast extended well beyond the characters who traveled with Goku or competed against him in the tournaments. There was a whole population of the story's world, people in the towns and villages the adventure moved through, people who had their own relationships to the Dragon Balls, or to the army, or to the martial arts tradition, people who existed at the edges of the main story and who gave it the texture of a world that was fully inhabited. Some of these peripheral figures appeared only once, in a single chapter or a handful of panels, and were never seen again. A shopkeeper in a town Goku passed through on his way to the army's territory. A soldier who surrendered rather than fight and who was allowed to walk away. A village elder who had been holding a Dragon Ball as a decoration for decades without knowing what it was. These figures were sketched quickly, and they were real. They had the quality of people who had been there before the story arrived and who would continue there after it left. This commitment to a populated world was part of what gave Dragon Ball its particular atmosphere. It was not a story happening in a vacuum, against a backdrop of empty space filled with whoever the plot required at any given moment. It was a story happening in a world, among people who were doing things regardless of whether those things were relevant to the plot. The world existed for its own reasons, not as a stage for the narrative, and the narrative was happening inside it rather than on top of it. The capsule technology that Bulma's family had developed was part of what made this populated world believable. If capsules could compress objects to pocket size and release them on demand, then travel and trade and the transportation of goods across long distances was genuinely possible for ordinary people, not just for wealthy or privileged ones. The technology had democratized the logistics of living in the world, and the world felt that way, full of people who were mobile, who had arrived from other places, and who might leave for other places, who were not fixed to a single location by the difficulties of travel. The Dragon Ball anime's episode count for the original series was exactly 153 episodes, airing between February of 1986 and April of 1989. This span of slightly over 3 years covered the entirety of the original manga story from the Pilaf saga through the end of the Piccolo Jr. saga, with the addition of the filler episodes that expanded certain sequences and added the original material discussed earlier. The pacing of the anime adaptation relative to the manga was more expansive in the original series than it would become in Dragon Ball Z. A single chapter of manga might occupy an entire episode of the anime, with the added time used to extend fight sequences, to dwell on moments that the manga had moved past quickly, to add conversational exchanges between characters that the manga had implied rather than shown. This expansion was generally successful in the original series because the material it was working with was generous. Toriyama's early chapters were full of ideas and moments that could sustain expansion without dilution. The voice cast assembled for the original Dragon Ball anime established performances that became inseparable from the characters for everyone who experienced the series in Japanese. Masako Nozawa brought a warmth and a quality of genuine innocence to Goku that transcended the animation around it. A voice so completely inhabited that it was impossible to hear it and not understand immediately who this person was and what they were about. The other members of the cast were equally specific in their choices, and the specificity accumulated over 153 episodes into something that felt less like voice acting and more like these people simply being themselves. The music of Shunsuke Kikuchi deserves its own extended consideration, because it was as formative to the experience of the original Dragon Ball as any other element of the adaptation. Kikuchi had a long career in anime composition before Dragon Ball and would have a long one after it. His approach to the original Dragon Ball score was built around a relatively small number of themes that were varied and combined in different ways across the series. A compositional economy that gave the score a coherence and a specific identity that was immediately recognizable. The main adventure theme carried the quality of movement. Not urgent, not dramatic, but forward-moving, the musical equivalent of a morning with somewhere pleasant to go. It was the sound of Goku in motion, of the story underway, of the world being moved through with pleasure and without particular urgency. When this theme played, you knew exactly what was happening. Someone was going somewhere, and it was going to be interesting. The battle themes were different in kind, more percussive, more tense, built around rhythms that communicated the stakes of the confrontations without making those stakes feel overwhelming. They were not the crushing orchestral weight of later Dragon Ball Z music. They were lighter, more in keeping with the original series' general tonal register, and they served the fights well precisely because they did not overpower them. The quieter themes, the ones that played over scenes of rest, of conversation, of the story pausing to breathe, were among Kikuchi's most accomplished work. They had the quality of late afternoon, of the hour after something difficult, when the difficulty is over and you are simply present in the world without anything being demanded of you. They gave the rest a musical reality, making it feel like rest rather than like pause. The connection between the original Dragon Ball and the broader tradition of adventure manga that preceded it is worth tracing briefly, because understanding what Toriyama was working with and what he was working against illuminates the specific choices he made. Adventure manga in Weekly Shonen Jump before Dragon Ball had been characterized by a specific kind of protagonist, often older than Goku, usually more self-aware, typically motivated by a clear and articulable goal that structured the narrative around it. The heroes of these stories knew what they wanted and pursued it with deliberate purpose, and the obstacles in their way were measured against that purpose. Goku was different in ways that were immediately apparent and not entirely comfortable for the conventions of the genre. He was young, child young, not teenager young. He was not particularly self-aware. His goals were immediate and concrete rather than abstract and ambitious. Find the 4-star ball, win the tournament, get stronger. He did not have a vision of the future toward which he was working. He had a present moment that he was engaged with completely. This difference created a different kind of story. Because Goku was not working toward a defined destination, the journey was genuinely open. The direction he moved in was determined by what was in front of him, not by a fixed point ahead, and this gave the story its characteristic quality of discovery, the sense that neither the characters nor the reader knew exactly what was coming. Because the arrival point was not defined in advance, Toriyama had absorbed the conventions of adventure manga thoroughly enough to know how to use them and when to depart from them, and his departures were consistent enough to constitute a genuine alternative approach rather than simply an aberration. Dragon Ball was not a departure from the tradition. It was a new path within it, built with full knowledge of the paths that had come before. The great Demon King Piccolo's hierarchy, the system of demon subordinates he commanded, is one of the more detailed pieces of organizational world-building in the original series, and it rewarded attention in ways that the story did not make explicit. Each of the demons Piccolo sent was named for an instrument. Tambourine, who killed Krillin. Symbol, who was sent to gather Dragon Balls. Drum, the most powerful of them, who served as a direct weapon. This naming convention gave the demons a collective identity that was both unified and slightly absurd. Music was not typically associated with demonic forces, and the incongruity was characteristic of Toriyama's approach to antagonist design. He did not want his villains to be simply frightening, he wanted them to be interesting, and the instrument names were a small, specific, memorable detail that made them interesting. The demons were extensions of Piccolo rather than independent figures. They had personalities. Tambourine was cold and efficient, Symbol was greedier and more self-interested. But those personalities were organized entirely around their function as instruments of their creator's will. They were not people who had chosen to serve Piccolo. They were Piccolo's creations, products of his own body, manifesting his intentions in physical form. This relationship between Piccolo and his demons was a specific kind of antagonist hierarchy that Dragon Ball would return to and modify in later arcs. The idea of a powerful figure who could create subordinates rather than merely commanding them was structurally different from the Red Ribbon Army's command structure, and the difference was significant. You could dismantle a command structure by defeating its leader. You could not dismantle a creator-creation relationship the same way, because the creations were not separate from their source. They were the source, manifested differently. Goku's eating was, across the original series, one of the most consistent and specific expressions of his relationship to the world. He ate enormous quantities. This was established early and maintained throughout, the scale of his consumption scaling upward alongside the scale of his power and his physical development. What he ate was not particularly important to him. He ate what was available, and he ate it completely, and he was done. There was no ambivalence about the eating, no social management of appetite, no performance of modesty or restraint. He was hungry and he ate and he was satisfied and he stopped. This directness about eating paralleled his directness about everything else. Goku did not have the social complications that most people carry around their appetites. The awareness of how much was appropriate, the calibration of what was expected, the management of other people's reactions to your hunger. He was hungry when he was hungry, full when he was full, and neither state required anything more from him than honest response. The communal meals that punctuated the adventure were often the story's most emotionally warm moments. A meal shared after a fight resolved, after a Dragon Ball found, after some difficult thing had been survived. These meals had the quality of celebration even when they were not presented as celebrations. They were the story's way of saying, "This happened, we are still here, this is good." The eating was the form that contentment took. Bulma, who had grown up with access to plenty, and who approached food with the casual relationship of someone for whom it had never been scarce, responded to Goku's eating with consistent exasperation that was itself a form of affection. Her exasperation acknowledged him. It registered his presence. The fact that she was perpetually annoyed by how much he ate meant that she was perpetually paying attention to how much he ate, which meant that she was paying attention to him. The original Dragon Ball's approach to comedy and action as complementary rather than competing modes is one of the things that made it genuinely unusual among the fighting manga of its period. Most manga that were primarily about fighting were not also genuinely funny. They might have light moments, comic relief characters, occasional jokes, but the comedy was subordinate to the action and took place in service of it, providing relief from tension rather than existing as a legitimate mode of engagement in its own right. The action was the story, and the comedy was the pause between action sequences. Dragon Ball treated comedy and action as equally valid modes of telling the same story. The fights were funny, not in the sense of being unserious. They were serious, genuinely consequential, but in the sense of containing Toriyama's specific comic sensibility throughout, expressed through the characters' responses to the situations they found themselves in, through the visual gags embedded in the fight choreography, through the moments when someone's plan failed in the most particular and embarrassing way possible. And the comedy was also often action. The scenes of Goku pursuing Korin around the tower were both genuinely athletic and genuinely comic. Oolong's shape-shifting was both practically useful in various situations and consistently hilarious in its execution. The first meeting between Goku and Roshi was both a combat encounter in the informal sense of two fighters testing each other, and one of the funniest scenes in the early story. This integration meant that tonal consistency was maintained across the full range of the story's modes. You did not step out of the story's world when it was funny, the way you might step out of a primarily serious story's world when its comic relief moments failed to integrate. Dragon Ball's world was one in which things could be funny and serious at once, because that is what the world is actually like. The specific technique of the Dodonpa, the energy blast technique of the Crane School associated with Master Shen and taught to Tien, was Dragon Ball's first serious rival technique to the Kamehameha, and its introduction in the Tournament Saga had a specific function in establishing that the Turtle School's approach was not the only approach, where the Kamehameha was wide and expansive, a wave-type technique that relied on sustained output and that could be adjusted in direction and power. The Dodonpa was a concentrated finger beam, narrow and precise and devastating in its focused application. It was a different philosophy of force, not the open release of gathered energy, but the directed application of concentrated power through the smallest possible aperture. This difference in technique mirrored the difference in philosophy between the two schools. Roshi's teaching was about development, broad, expansive, encompassing. Shen's teaching was about precision and result, narrow, directed, optimized. Both approaches had genuine merit in their domains, and neither was presented as simply superior to the other. The fights between students of the two schools were interesting precisely because they were comparisons between different ways of being good at the same thing. Tien's eventual adoption of elements from both schools, his continued use of Crane School techniques alongside the development of his own original abilities, was the story's acknowledgement that the best fighters synthesized rather than specialized. The limits of any single school became visible when its students encountered something the school had not prepared them for, and the response of intelligent fighters was to expand their range rather than to insist that their existing range was sufficient. The character of Chiaotzu carries a specific quiet dignity throughout the original series that is easy to overlook because he speaks infrequently and because the story generally does not place him at the center of its attention. He was small and pale, and he moved through the world with a stillness that could be mistaken for passivity. His psychic abilities, the telekinesis that allowed him to freeze opponents, the capacity for arithmetic that functioned as a countermeasure to Tien's weakness to certain techniques, were real and specific, but they were not the kind of abilities that produced memorable set pieces. They were support abilities, abilities that created conditions for others, rather than producing outcomes by themselves. What Chiaotzu had that most characters did not was certainty about his loyalties. He was completely and unreservedly loyal to Tien, and the loyalty was not performed or announced. It was simply visible in the consistency of his presence, in the fact that he was always where Tien was and always oriented toward Tien's well-being. This kind of loyalty is not dramatic in the conventional sense. It does not announce itself, but it creates a specific quality of trust that the story used carefully, and the scene in which Chiaotzu chose to die rather than allow harm to come to the people he cared about was the moment when the quiet dignity of his presence throughout the story became fully legible. The fortune teller Baba arc, the sequence that ran from Goku's initial request for her services through the 5 fights and the afternoon with Grandpa Gohan, is structurally one of the most interesting portions of the original story because it was doing several things at once, none of which it announced. On the surface, it was a series of fights in an unusual venue, with the prize being information rather than a trophy. But the fights had a different quality from the tournament fights because the stakes were personal rather than competitive. Goku was not there to prove something or to measure himself against a tradition. He was there because he needed something, and Baba had set a specific price for it, and he was paying the price. The fighters Baba presented were genuinely challenging in ways that the tournament's preliminary rounds had not been. They each had abilities that required Goku to develop specific responses rather than rely on general excellence, and the development of those responses across the 5 fights was a microcosm of the larger training arc, each challenge producing specific growth rather than general accumulation? And the final fight, the one with his grandfather, was the payment that Baba exacted in a different register, not a physical price, but an emotional one. Goku fought someone he loved, someone he thought he would never see again, and the love and the fighting coexisted without either one diminishing the other. The fight was genuine. The love was genuine. They were not in conflict, because for Goku they never were. Love and full engagement with the moment were the same quality expressed in different circumstances. The moment when Goku first achieved a state of increased power during his confrontation with Piccolo Daimao, the surge of rage-fueled strength that followed Krillin's death, was not the Super Saiyan transformation that would become the franchise's most iconic image. It was something earlier, something quieter, something that the story did not name or explain, but that it rendered with complete clarity. Goku felt something that he had not felt before in quite this way, and that the story communicated through the quality of the panels, the way Toriyama drew Goku's face in this moment, the way the air around him felt charged rather than still, the way the violence of his response to Tambourine had a quality of absolute commitment that went beyond what the situation strictly required. This was the first glimpse of what would eventually be named and systematized and expanded into the mythology of Saiyan power. But in the original series, it was unnamed and unexplained, and the decision not to explain it was correct. Explaining it would have made it a rule, a mechanism, something that could be understood and predicted. Leaving it unexplained made it a quality, something that was part of who Goku was, that expressed itself in moments of extreme feeling. That was real without being reducible to any framework the story had established. The mystery of it was part of what made it important. It was a hint at depth in a character who had already been established as extraordinary, a suggestion that what the story had shown was not the full extent of what was there. That suggestion would carry forward for years, and the carrying of it was one of Dragon Ball's most patient and most successful slow burn effects. The artwork in the original Dragon Ball is worth considering from the specific angle of Toriyama's relationship to negative space. The empty areas of a panel, the places where nothing is drawn. Toriyama used negative space deliberately and skillfully throughout the original series. He understood that the eye needed rest between areas of visual information, and that panels which were too densely drawn could exhaust the reader in ways that undermined the pacing he was working to create. His panels breathed. There were skies that were genuinely sky, not filled with clouds and birds and ambient detail, but open, simple expanses of white or pale tone that let the important visual elements exist without competition. This was particularly evident in the fight sequences, where a panel showing a single figure in motion often gave that figure most of the panel to itself, with only the ground or a minimal horizon line providing spatial context. The space around the figure made the figure's movement more legible. It made the speed readable. It made the impact, when impact came, feel like it had landed into something real, rather than into a visual noise that absorbed it without distinction. The character designs themselves were drawn with the same principle in mind. Toriyama's figures were clean, not simplified in the sense of losing expressiveness, but stripped of unnecessary complexity, with every line doing specific work. The orange gi was a single continuous shape with minimal internal detail. The faces were expressive with relatively few elements. The economy of the design made the expressiveness more powerful, because there was no competition between the elements of the face. The Ox King's Fire Mountain, that burning peak, visible for miles, where Chi-Chi lived and where her father had been isolated for years by a fire that no ordinary means could extinguish, was one of the original story's most visually distinctive locations, and it carried a specific emotional weight beyond its function as a setting. Roshi was the one who had the ability to extinguish the fire, using the Kamehameha technique in an application that demonstrated that the technique was not only a weapon, that it could be directed towards ends other than combat, that its power was responsive to the intention of the person using it. He used the Kamehameha on the mountain, and the fire was extinguished, and the Ox King could descend from his isolation. This was one of the original series' quiet thematic statements that strength was not inherently for fighting, that the same power that could destroy could also restore. That technique developed for combat could serve other purposes entirely, that the martial arts tradition Roshi embodied was not limited to the ring or the battlefield. It was a way of engaging with the world, and the world was wider than any single context in which that engagement took place. The Ox King's gratitude was genuine and lasting. He was not simply a character who served the plot function and then disappeared. He remained in the story's periphery, and his presence there was always warm, always the specific warmth of someone who had been helped in a real way and who had not forgotten it. The specific quality of Toriyama's humor is worth spending a paragraph considering, because it was the humor of someone who found people genuinely funny, rather than someone who was constructing jokes from the outside. His comedy worked because it emerged from character rather than from situation. The jokes in Dragon Ball were funny because of who the characters were, and the who of them was consistent enough that you could predict, in general terms, how they would respond to any given circumstance. And the prediction itself was part of the pleasure. You knew Oolong would look for the worst possible interpretation of any event. You knew Roshi would find a way to make any interaction about his interest in young women. You knew Yamcha would be undermined by his social anxiety at the worst possible moment. But the predictions were not fully accurate. The characters surprised you within the range of who they were, because people surprise you that way. Oolong occasionally had a moment of genuine courage that was entirely consistent with his character and entirely unexpected. Yamcha occasionally demonstrated a quality of resilience that his surface presentation did not suggest. Roshi occasionally revealed a depth of genuine care and genuine wisdom that the running joke of his perversion had been obscuring. The surprise within consistency is what makes a character feel alive rather than performed, and Toriyama understood it without, one suspects, theorizing about it particularly. He understood it the way people who are good at understanding people understand it, intuitively, through attention. The journey up Korin Tower was 100 floors and took 3 days the first time Goku climbed it, which means that Goku climbed approximately 33 floors per day, which means that the tower, while extraordinarily tall by ordinary standards, was something he could move through in the way that serious physical effort allowed him to move through things, not quickly in the absolute sense, but steadily, with the particular durability of someone whose body had been trained to keep doing difficult things for a long time. The tower's height was not an obstacle in the way that the army's fortress had been an obstacle. There was nothing to defeat. There was only the climbing, which continued for as long as the climbing needed to continue, and then it was done. This was characteristic of Toriyama's approach to training sequences. The difficulty was real and was honored by the time it took, but it was not dramatic in the sense of requiring a crisis to resolve. It simply required persistence. Goku had persistence in the way that he had everything else, in full, without reserve, without calculating whether the amount was proportionate to the reward. The first time he climbed the tower, it was after the Red Ribbon Army's defeat, driven by the knowledge that what he needed next was above rather than behind him. The second time was after Piccolo Daimao's defeat of him, when he needed more than anything the particular kind of knowledge that Korin held, the knowledge of what was above the tower, which was itself only knowledge of the direction in which to move. Korin could not give him what was above the tower. Only going there could do that. There is something particular about the way the original Dragon Ball ended its major arcs, not with triumph exactly, but with completion, that set it apart from stories that saved their most satisfying moments for the closing chapters. The Pilaf saga ended not with the defeat of a terrible villain, but with the failure of a small plan and the survival of everyone involved, and the continuation of the journey in a new direction. The tournament saga ended not with a championship belt, but with the education of 2 students who had been shown how far they still had to go. The Red Ribbon Army ended with the destruction of a massive organization by one boy who had been looking for something else entirely, and the something he had been looking for was found in the quiet aftermath. Not in the fight itself, These endings were not anticlimactic, they were appropriate, scaled to what the arc had actually been about, rather than to a generic template of story resolution that required a specific type of emotional peak at a specific moment. The arcs had been about something specific, and their endings honored that specific thing by concluding it on its own terms. The exception, in some ways, was the Piccolo Jr. saga, which did build to a traditional climactic fight and which delivered on the build with full commitment. But even there, the aftermath was not triumphant in the conventional sense. It was marriage and food and the continuation of the world and the departure of two people on a cloud toward whatever came next. The triumph was real and it was quiet, and it was already behind them before the chapter ended. The original Dragon Ball's relationship to its own mythology was consistently respectful without being reverent, which is one of the harder tonal balances to maintain in a long-running serialized story. Respectful meant that the story took its own rules seriously, honored the consequences of its own events, and did not treat the established world as a resource to be consumed at will for dramatic convenience. The Dragon Ball rules were consistent. The power hierarchies, once established, held until they were explicitly expanded. The characters' personalities were stable enough to be recognizable across years of story and across events that changed them in specific ways while leaving their fundamental qualities intact. Not reverent meant that the story was not afraid to be funny about its own mythology. Shenron was an ancient, immensely powerful being, and he was also occasionally addressed in ways that acknowledged the slightly absurd premise of a dragon appearing in the sky to grant wishes and then disappearing again. The tournaments were serious, competitive events, and they also contained Jackie Chan, who was Roshi in a wig, which meant that every fight Jackie Chan had was serious within the ring and farcical in the larger context. Piccolo Daima was genuinely terrifying, and his demons were named after instruments. This balance, taking the story seriously without taking it solemnly, was one of the original Dragon Ball's most consistent and most characteristic qualities, and it was one that the later series, particularly Dragon Ball Super, attempted with varying degrees of success to recapture. The original achieved it because Toriyama had held both qualities from the beginning, because the story had never been required to choose between being serious and being funny, and so it remained, naturally and without effort, both. The night is very deep now, and the telling has been long, and the world of the original Dragon Ball has been walked through carefully from one end to the other. From the November morning in 1984, when Bulma's car hit a small boy in the mountains, to the afternoon when Goku and Chi-Chi rose together on the flying Nimbus into a sky that was wide and calm and full of whatever was coming next. Every character is where they are. Every Dragon Ball is where it has been scattered. The world is whole. And you are here, in the quiet, having been somewhere for a while. Somewhere built with care and populated with people who are real in the specific way that characters who are loved become real, whose realness does not depend on the medium or the era or anything except the sustained attention of someone who found them interesting and wanted you to find them interesting too. You have found them, they have found you. This is what stories are for, and still the night permits a little more. The story is patient. It has been here for decades, and it will be here tomorrow, and there is no harm in spending another quiet hour inside it. The original Dragon Ball introduced the concept of the Senzu Bean in the final portion of the Red Ribbon Army saga, and the introduction was handled with the same quiet care that characterized the series' best world-building details. Senzu beans grew at the top of Korin Tower, tended by Korin himself, with what appeared to be genuine agricultural attention. They were small and unremarkable in appearance. You would not pick them up from the ground and understand what you were holding. But they restored the body completely, healed wounds, replaced lost energy, removed fatigue as if it had never existed. A single bean could take someone from the edge of death to full health. The beans were scarce. Korin did not produce them in abundance. Each one he gave was given with the specific awareness that giving it meant one fewer bean in the world for the foreseeable future, and he gave them only when the situation genuinely warranted it. This scarcity was not a plot device to prevent characters from solving all their problems with beans. It was an honest reflection of what something genuinely powerful and genuinely rare was like, present in the world, available in limited quantities, worth preserving. The introduction of the beans changed the story's calculus around injury and recovery in subtle ways. Knowing that complete recovery was possible under specific circumstances made the withholding of that recovery more significant. When a character did not have a bean, the injury was serious in a way it had not been before the beans existed. The beans created a standard of recovery against which all ordinary recovery was measured. The turtle, Master Roshi's companion, the creature who had been walking to the ocean when Goku and Bulma encountered him and helped him on his way, was one of the original Dragon Ball's smallest significant figures. He was old in the specific way that turtles are old, by human standards extraordinarily long-lived, carrying centuries in the slow deliberation of his movement and the steady quality of his attention. He had been Roshi's companion for so long that the exact beginning of their friendship was somewhere in the past, beyond precise reckoning. He was simply always there, as Roshi was always there, and they had the relationship of two beings who had been in each other's company long enough to have stopped requiring anything from each other beyond presence. The turtles returned to the ocean, the journey he had been on when Goku and Bulma found him, the journey that would eventually bring him back to Roshi and would set off the chain of events that led to the cloud and the uniform, and the beginning of everything, was a journey he had been making slowly and steadily for longer than the story told us. He had been going to the ocean. He was going to the ocean. He arrived at the ocean. The journey had been completed over a span of time that was not particularly dramatic, and that the story did not linger over, and the completion of the journey started something enormous. Small kindnesses with enormous consequences are one of the original Dragon Ball's most consistent structural motifs. A boy helps a turtle get to the ocean, and what follows from that help is years of story. The question of how Goku understood morality, not as an abstract system, but as a lived practice, is one of the original series' most interesting background questions, and it is never answered directly. Because Goku never thought about morality abstractly, he did not have a moral code. He had responses. When someone was in trouble and he could help, he helped. When someone attacked him, he defended himself and then was done defending himself. When someone was cruel to someone else, he was irritated in the specific way that he was irritated by obstacles, not morally indignant, not righteously angry, but directly and simply opposed to what was happening and willing to do something about it. The cruelty was wrong not because it violated a principle, but because it was happening to a person in front of him. This approach to morality was neither sophisticated nor naive. It was immediate. It operated entirely in the present moment, and it was consistent in that present across every situation the story placed him in. He did not wrestle with difficult moral questions, not because he was incapable of difficulty, but because the difficulty of the question was less relevant to him than the reality of the situation. Something was happening. Was it good? Was it not good? What did he need to do? This made him, in some ways, the most reliably ethical character in the story, because his ethics were not dependent on the right circumstances or the right mood or the right level of information. They were simply what he did, in the same way that breathing was what he did, not a decision but a continuous condition of being. The original Dragon Ball's ending, the marriage, the cloud, the beginning of what would become the Goku who was Dragon Ball Z's central figure, was written with the knowledge that it was not an ending. Toriyama has said in various interviews over the years that he did not originally intend Dragon Ball to continue as long as it did, that the story he had in mind when he began was a specific shape that was complete in itself, and that the continuation that became Dragon Ball Z was driven by external pressure and reader demand rather than by an internal creative necessity he had felt from the beginning. This is probably not entirely accurate in the way that creators' retrospective accounts of their own work are often not entirely accurate. Memory is creative, and the story that we tell about how we made a thing tends to be shaped by the thing that resulted. What is clear, from the evidence of the work itself, is that the original Dragon Ball ended in a way that was genuinely complete as a story. The characters had been through something, they had grown, the world had been changed by their presence in it, and the people in the story were in a better place than when it started. That is what endings should do. What also happened at that ending, whether Toriyama intended it or not, was the preservation of possibility. Piccolo was alive. The Dragon Balls were scattered. Goku was married and still young and still in full possession of the qualities that made him who he was. The door was not closed. It was simply the end of one chapter in the life of a world that continued. The sky above Mount Paozu, the mountain where Goku was born into his adopted human life. The mountain that Grandpa Gohan chose to make his home, the mountain that is the original and permanent home of the story's beginning, has the quality of all the skies in the original Dragon Ball: wide, clear, patient. It is the sky under which a small boy learned to fish and learned to fight, and learned that the world was interesting and worth engaging with fully. It is the sky that the flying Nimbus moved through when Goku first rode it, the cloud bright against blue or dark depending on the season. It is the sky that was there before the story began and that is still there, presumably now. Indifferent to the story's passage, unchanged by the decades of events that occurred beneath it, present in the way that the world is present, without commentary, without requirement, simply there. The original Dragon Ball loved this sky. It returned to it when it needed to in moments of rest between the movement and the fighting. It used it to locate the story in a world that had scale, that had something genuinely large and genuinely indifferent above all the small, specific, human-sized things happening below it. The sky gave the story proportion. It said, "This is large and you are small, and both of those things are fine. Let yourself go towards sleep now. The story is held. The characters are whole." The world that Akira Toriyama built in 1984, one careful panel at a time, is still standing, still inhabited, still full of the particular quality of life that honest attention creates. The four-star ball is warm in the dark somewhere. The cloud is moving slowly above the mountain where it has always moved. The Dragon Balls are scattered and patient and waiting for whoever comes next. You have been here. You have listened. That is enough. There is one more thing to be said, and it is the simplest thing. And it is the thing that has been said in every different way throughout this long telling, without ever being said quite directly. Dragon Ball is a story about someone who loved being alive, not loved life as an abstraction, not loved the idea of being in the world or the philosophical weight of existence, loved the specific, concrete, moment-to-moment experience of being present in a body that could do things, in a world that was full of other bodies doing things, in a situation that was always changing and therefore always interesting. Loved the morning run. Loved the fish that fought back when you caught it. Loved the fight that required everything you had, and then a little more. Loved the meal after. Loved the next morning when you could do it again. Goku's love of being alive was not naive. He knew that the world contained loss. He had lost Grandpa Gohan. He had lost Krillin. Briefly, and the brevity did not diminish how it felt. He knew that the things and people that mattered could be taken, and he had been in the place where that knowledge was not abstract, but immediate and real. He knew all of this, and he loved being alive anyway, not in spite of the knowledge but alongside it, with the full awareness that the things worth loving were worth loving precisely because they were finite and present and real. This is the foundation that the original Dragon Ball built. Not the power levels, not the transformations, not the tournaments and the villains and the expanding scale of the threats. The foundation was a boy on a cloud, genuinely glad to be there, moving through a world that was interesting and good, and worth every moment of the engagement it asked for. Everything else was built on that, and it holds. The night is ending, or continuing, depending on where you are and what the clock says. And none of that matters particularly. What matters is that you are somewhere comfortable, and the story has been with you for a while, and the being with has been what it was, a little time inside something larger than the immediate, a little company on whatever night this is. The Dragon Balls are scattered across the world, in lakes and caves and the pockets of people who don't know what they're carrying. Shenron is wherever ancient dragons rest between summonings, somewhere patient and quiet, waiting for the seventh ball and the sky to darken and the call to come. He will answer when it comes. He always does. Goku is wherever Goku is, on the cloud, probably, or eating, or both, and you are here. Sleep well. And if sleep does not come immediately, if the night is still wide and you're still present in it, then let this continue a little further. There is always one more thing to notice about a story you love. The original Dragon Ball was published in Japan at a moment when manga culture was in the process of becoming something that would shape global entertainment for decades. Weekly Shonen Jump was not simply a magazine. It was a cultural institution, a weekly ritual for millions of Japanese readers, a shared experience that crossed age groups and social categories in ways that few other media could manage. When you read Jump, you were reading what everyone was reading. You were part of something that had a collective presence. Dragon Ball arrived in this context and immediately became one of its central pillars. The series was not an instant triumph in the sense of achieving its peak immediately. It grew across its run, building readership steadily through the Pilaf and Tournament sagas, before accelerating into the broader recognition that the Red Ribbon Army and the King Piccolo sagas brought. By the time of the 22nd and 23rd tournament arcs, Dragon Ball was one of Jump's most important ongoing series, and Toriyama was one of the magazine's most significant creative figures. This growth was not arbitrary. It followed from the accumulation of quality, from the reader-to-reader transmission of the specific pleasure of reading something that was consistently good, that delivered on its promises week after week, that was building towards something while being satisfying in the present. The word of mouth that sustained Dragon Ball's early growth was the word of mouth that sustains any long-running serialized work. Someone found it and told someone else, and that someone found it and told someone else, and the circle expanded outward from the center of the story's quality. The specific visual language that Toriyama developed for showing speed in the original Dragon Ball, the motion lines, the blur effects, the use of after images, became the visual vocabulary for speed in a significant portion of the manga and anime that followed. His approach was not invented from nothing. The techniques existed in various forms in manga before Dragon Ball, and Toriyama had absorbed them from the work he had grown up reading. But his application of them was so consistent and so legible and so well integrated into his overall visual style that they became, in Dragon Ball's specific version, something new. Readers who came to Dragon Ball and then to other manga could see the influence in both directions, could see what Dragon Ball had taken and what Dragon Ball had given. The blur that surrounded a fast-moving figure, with the trailing edge of the motion visible as a kind of echo, this was Toriyama's most characteristic speed effect, and it communicated the precise quality of the kind of speed involved, not blur as chaos. Blur as direction. The figure was going somewhere specific, very quickly, and the blur showed the vector. This directional quality made the speed readable rather than just impressive, and readability was always more important to Toriyama than impressiveness. The after-image technique, the multiple echoes of a figure in different positions, suggesting movement too fast to follow with normal perception, appeared increasingly in the later tournament fights, where the speed of the fighters had grown beyond what single trail motion lines could convey. The after images communicated a different quality, not just speed, but the specific kind of speed that made a fighter genuinely difficult to track, the speed that changed the fundamental problem of combat from landing a blow to finding the target. The original Dragon Ball's cast grew across its run in ways that felt organic rather than forced, each new character arriving at a moment when the story needed something specific that an existing character could not provide. Launch, the woman with two distinct personalities, one gentle and passive and one violent and aggressive, activated by sneezing, arrived as part of the training saga, introduced as someone Roshi had been pursuing for years. And she stayed through much of the original series as a peripheral but consistent presence. Her dual nature was played primarily for comedy, But it also served as a continuous mild absurdist undercurrent in the group's domestic life during the training periods, a reminder that the world the story inhabited was one where unusual things were simply part of the texture of living. The Ox King's presence in the story after his initial introduction at Fire Mountain was relatively quiet, more presence than participant. He appeared at the tournaments, at the margins of significant events, in scenes that established that he was still there, still aware of what was happening in his daughter's life and in the lives of the people she was connected to. He was, in the most literal sense, family, the in-law who did not always understand what was happening but who showed up anyway, because showing up was what family did. The peripheral characters who had been helped by Goku across the original series, the villagers, the soldiers who had surrendered, the people in the towns he had passed through, were not brought back for reunion scenes or callbacks. They existed in the stories past the way real people exist in real pasts, present in what they contributed, absent from the ongoing present, neither forgotten nor foregrounded. This was honest. Not everyone you help becomes part of your story. Most of them continue their own story separately, and the contribution they made to yours is real, even if they never appear again. The original Dragon Ball's position within the global history of animation is something that has been extensively documented and extensively discussed, and the documentation and discussion have, if anything, understated what the series actually accomplished. It arrived in the United States in the 1990s in a version that was significantly altered from the Japanese original, edited for content, redubbed, restructured in ways that changed specific scenes and occasionally the sequence of events. This version was not beloved by everyone who encountered it, particularly by those who had access to the original, but it introduced Dragon Ball to an enormous audience who would not otherwise have encountered it, and many of those people encountering the original later were moved by the comparison, by the recognition of what the original had been and what the edited version had altered, and by the specific pleasure of meeting a story they had loved in a form closer to what it had originally been. The series' global spread, through dubbing, subtitling, fan-sub communities in the early internet era, the gradual official localization of the complete catalog, created a situation in which Dragon Ball was being discovered and rediscovered by new generations of viewers in many different contexts and under many different circumstances. Each of those discoveries producing the same fundamental response, recognition that this was something, that the specific quality of it was real and was worth the time it asked for. This is what endurance looks like in a serialized story, not preservation in amber, not the static repetition of a fixed original, but ongoing discovery by new audiences in new contexts of something that had been built well enough to hold across the distance between the moment of its creation and the moment of their encounter with it. The path from the 4-star ball to everything that followed is, in retrospect, visible in every chapter. The story was always going somewhere. It did not always know exactly where, and neither did Toriyama, but the direction was consistent toward more, toward larger, toward the full realization of what this world and these characters could be. The original Dragon Ball is the part of that path where the going was most clearly itself, most clearly a boy on a cloud in a world that was wide and strange and full of interesting people. Moving forward without a fixed destination, finding what was there to be found. It is also the part that supports everything else, the foundation, the beginning and beginnings, when they are built with honesty and care and genuine affection for the thing being begun, are worth returning to. They hold something that the later, larger things cannot always replicate, the specific quality of a story that is still becoming what it is going to be, still open to whatever is next, still lit by the original clarity of someone who had something to say and was saying it for the first time. The original Dragon Ball has that quality. It has had it for 40 years. It will have it for 40 more. The cloud is still moving. The sky is still wide. The world is still whole. Rest now. This is the original Dragon Ball lore. Not the golden hair and the screaming skies. Not the tournaments that held the fate of multiple universes in the balance. This is the version that began in 1984 with two characters meeting in the mountains, one of them picking up the other's car and holding it over his head and waiting for it to do something threatening. It is quieter than what came after, it is smaller, it is funnier and stranger, and in ways that are not always easy to articulate, more itself, more clearly an expression of a single creator's imagination. A world that had not yet been required to be anything other than what it was. The original story set a foundation that has supported decades of stories since its conclusion. The characters it built, the relationships it established, the philosophy it embedded in its protagonist, all of it carried forward, and the carrying was possible because the foundation was genuine, not clever, not constructed for maximum narrative efficiency. Genuine, built by someone who cared about the people in the story and wanted the reader to care about them too, and who trusted that care was enough. It was enough. It has always been enough. And now the mountains are quiet, and the dragon balls are scattered, and somewhere above the clouds, a golden cloud is moving slowly through the same sky it has always moved through, carrying someone who is going somewhere and in no particular hurry to arrive. Because the going is the point, and the sky is very wide, and there is no reason to rush through something this beautiful. Let yourself rest now. The story will be here when you wake, exactly as you left it, patient, whole, and waiting with the particular warmth of something that has loved you from the very beginning. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new. This is the version that began in 1984, with two characters meeting in the mountains, one of them picking up the other's car and holding it over his head and waiting for it to do something threatening. It is quieter than what came after. It is smaller, it is funnier, and stranger. And in ways that are not always easy to articulate, more itself, more clearly an expression of a single creator's imagination, a world that had not yet been required to be anything other than what it was. The original story set a foundation that has supported decades of stories since its conclusion. The characters it built, the relationships it established, the philosophy it embedded in its protagonist, all of it carried forward, and the carrying was possible because the foundation was genuine, not clever, not constructed for maximum narrative efficiency, genuine, built by someone who cared about the people in the story and wanted the reader to care about them too, and who trusted that care was enough. It was enough. It has always been enough. And now the mountains are quiet and the dragon balls are scattered, and somewhere above the clouds, a golden cloud is moving slowly through the same sky it has always moved through, carrying someone who is going somewhere and in no particular hurry to arrive, because the going is the point and the sky is very wide and there is no reason to rush through something this beautiful. Let yourself rest now. The story will be here when you wake, exactly as you left it, patient, whole, and waiting, with the particular warmth of something that has loved you from the very beginning. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new.